Francisco Franco is one of the most controversial European figures of the 20th century, and with Stalin, he's one of the only ones who outlived the Second World War period. This survival has led to Franco having a very murky reputation. Every single leading figure of the Third Reich, except Himmler, managed to escape Allied execution, and there was a feeling of unfinished business left behind. There was no grand trial of Hitler where he could be humiliated before the world. The Allied leaders didn't feel as if they had got even with him. He'd escaped their justice. Franco's regime throughout the war had clearly been Axis-aligned, although not a belligerent in the war, and all the Allied frustrations were now thrust upon him. Threat of invasion or regime change was ever present in Franco's mind, and his reputation was dragged through the mud. Franco was the new scapegoat. He was the only man left alive to take out their frustrations on. His regime was subjected to sanctions, scrutiny, and threats until the Allies realized the obvious and their attentions turned east towards the Soviet Union. Even then, only slowly did the Allied hate abate. But who was Franco really? What was his regime like? What was his story? Let's cut directly through the propaganda and the cliches and get to the reality, whether it be good, bad, or ugly. This is the complete history of Francisco Franco, from beginning to end. A couple things before we begin. Firstly, a disclaimer. The subject of this video, as noted, is a very controversial man. That doesn't mean this video needs to be, however. In no way, shape, or form is this video political, and it is purely a work of history. So please, keep that in mind and don't overthink it. Please be normal. Thank you. Secondly, a gigantic thank you to everyone for helping get this channel to 100,000 subscribers. I cannot thank you enough for the support over the past year, and it really does mean the world. As always though, the biggest thank you goes to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible with their kind donations. Without them, I wouldn't be able to do this for a living, and I cannot thank them enough. So if you'd like to support the channel, join the Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider signing up in one of the links in the description. Thank you. Even the $2 tier helps immensely. Francisco Franco was born on the 4th of December 1892 in the naval base of El Ferrol on Spain's northwestern coast. The Francos had been a seafaring family for a long time. 6 generations of Francisco's ancestors had been naval officers. Many had held the rank of admiral. Franco's father, Nicholas, was an officer in the naval supply system, and the family was an upper-middle-class one, which had resided in the region since 1730. Nicholas was an unusual, eccentric man whom didn't really fit the mold of the naval life. His peers viewed him as too eccentric and deviant. Indeed, he had seduced and impregnated the 14-year-old daughter of an army officer when he was 33 in Manila. Back home in El Ferrol, he met Pilar, the pious and attractive daughter of a senior naval officer. They married in May 1890, 5 months after the birth of his illegitimate son. It's unclear that she knew about it. During the next 8 years, the couple had 5 children, Francisco Franco being one of them. Franco would later describe his parents as stereotypical of that era. His father was a harsh authoritarian, indifferent to religion. His mother was virtuous and faithful, a near-perfect Christian wife and mother. Indeed, Nicholas Franco would view his wife's attempts to raise the children in the Catholic faith with increasing scorn. He was often out drinking and gambling. Pilar would suffer a lot with her husband, but she was an obedient and dutiful wife whom never rebuked him despite all he put her through. By 1907, Nicholas was sick of her and found her tediously boring. He happily accepted a posting far away in Madrid and left the family behind. He lived the rest of his life in the capital. He visited a little at first, but eventually outright abandoned the family and remarried. As for Francisco, known to his family as Paco or Paquito, Stanley G. Payne writes in his biography of him that he was, quote, small and spindly, though hardy enough, introverted, and inclined to identify with his doting mother, end quote. Nicholas was cold to the boy and barely even cared about him. Later in life, he would critique him both publicly and privately, as he was politically a left liberal. As a boy, Franco's father's behaviour affected him deeply, as he was a very sensitive child. Francisco never forgave him later in life, but also never publicly criticised him. On the positive side though, Francisco, as many neglected children do, made sure to never replicate his father's misdeeds. He grew up austere and chaste, and later on would be a completely devoted husband and family man. Some traits couldn't be shaken, however. As an adult, Franco could be an extremely cold and unforgiving individual to his enemies. This was perhaps also a result of his environment too. El Ferrol was a sleepy town of 20,000, which didn't even have running water until 1923. Conditions could be extremely harsh. Franco was brought up in a Spain which had just been utterly humiliated in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Naval life certainly wasn't what it once was. Regardless, Franco loved the place and would later recount how much he loved hearing the sailors' stories of faraway lands. At the age of 12, he was enrolled in a private secondary school whose purpose was to prepare students for military life. This time was used to develop his infamous self-control, discipline, and determination. Eventually, Franco decided that the best route would be in the army, not the navy, as in family tradition. Promotion tended to come more quickly there, yet his parents initially disagreed with his decision. Eventually, however, they gave in, and in June 1907, Franco's father accompanied the 14-year-old on the train journey to Toledo for his entrance examination. Franco recalled of the trip, quote, "I have to confess that this first trip with my father, who was rigid and harsh, was not much fun, for he lacked the trust and solicitude that would have made him agreeable," end quote. This was the first time Franco had ever left Galicia, and upon entering the barren-looking Castile, Franco said he felt as if he had left Europe and entered something more like Africa. Regardless, Franco was impressed with the Alcazar itself and marvelled at the giant statue of Charles V, which had the inscription, "I will be slain in Africa or enter Tunis as a conqueror." This felt a deep impression on Franco, and he duly passed his entrance exam without issue as one of the youngest in his class, quickly gaining the nickname Franquito, aka Little Franco. After all, he only ever grew to be around 5'4". Life here, however, was tough. Payne writes, quote, "Almost inevitably, this rather desirable-looking 14-year-old adolescent became the butt of the hazing of the older cadets. Occasionally, he was tied up or tossed out of his cot or had his books hidden, to his considerable indignation. His suffering was intense, and in later years, Franco would reflect that this had been a real Calvary," end quote. Franco never talked much about his early life, but he made it extremely clear to his daughter that these first few years in Toledo were rough for him. She later said of the topic, quote, "Whenever he referred to his education in Toledo, it seemed to me that he did not much enjoy it because he was very small. Yes, and short, too. Small in both senses. That was what he said. The bigger cadets could march with real rifles, but the small ones were given ones more like a toy," end quote. Regardless, in 1910, Franco graduated as a second lieutenant at the age of 17. He asked to be posted near his family. On the 22nd of August, he was assigned to an infantry regiment in El Farol. Here he remained until February 1912, when he finally got the posting to Morocco he had so desperately wanted. It was here that he became a man and found himself. He would later reminisce, quote, "Without Africa, I would hardly be able to explain me to myself," end quote. He spoke in the same vein to his daughter. She recalled, quote, "He adored Morocco. Where Papa became a man was in the Moroccan War. His first important assignment was with the indigenous troops of the Regulars, as they were called, and he got used to them and became very comfortable with them," end quote. Upon arrival, Franco found some things in an appalling state. Most officers were shockingly corrupt. Some even sold arms and other material to the Moroccan insurgents. The men themselves were horribly under-equipped and terribly organised. Almost immediately, Franco found that all his teachings in the classroom were effectively worth nothing in this land of irregular warfare. On the 19th of March, Franco was given command of a small reconnaissance column, and on that day, he received his baptism of fire when the group came under heavy attack from the enemy. 4 days later, he was part of a bigger operation, which resulted in disaster. The casualty statistics caused uproar back home, and the operation itself was cancelled. In May, the Spaniards tried again with greater success, and the insurgent leader was slain in battle. This was the first engagement in which the native Moroccan volunteers played a key role, and Franco was delighted when 2 of their wounded young lieutenants were immediately promoted to captain, one of whom was Emilio Mola. In June, it was Franco's turn, and he was promoted to first lieutenant, and by the time the year was up, he gained his first medal, the Cross of Military Merit, First Class, for serving in the combat zone for more than 3 months. In February 1913, Franco ended up at a small base near Melilla. It was a vile place of gambling, drinking, prostitution, sexual diseases, and even pedophilia. Franco, however, avoided these types of vices like the plague, and he quickly gained a reputation of keeping his nose clean in terms of both military corruption and Christian morality. It was here, however, that Franco fell in love for the first time in his life with a woman named Sofia Suburan. When he could obtain leave, he would join her in Melilla's Central Park with a chaperone for a walk. She would remark after Franco's death that he was rather boring. He shunned dancing, which she loved. He much preferred talking. Most of all, he seemed to come on too strong. Quote, "He was courteous, very refined, attentive, a perfect gentleman. He showed much character and was very agreeable, though overly attentive to the extent of wearing you out. Never any witticism, and much less any jokes. I think he was too serious for someone his age. Maybe that was why I didn't care much for him. He was rather boring," end quote. She also said that he treated her like a, quote, "supernatural being," as opposed to just a normal woman. Essentially, Franco was too nice. During the first 5 months of 1913, he sent her over 200 short letters and around 100 illustrated postcards. Many of them were full of complaints that she hadn't replied yet. She acted more like a woman of the 21st century than the 20th, and she strung him along for attention until it no longer pleased her ego. Things didn't work out, and it wouldn't be until many years later that Franco would find his pious wife, which he had dreamed of for so long. This emotional distress led Franco to take a dramatic step. He volunteered for one of the elite shock units. Most who took this route would meet a sticky end. A rare few, however, were able to attain glory. The regulars, made up of mostly North Africans, were the best troops the Spanish had at their disposal. Many Spaniards themselves were unenthusiastic soldiers, and often the daring Moroccans with their endless bravery and stamina were called upon for the most dangerous operations. These men didn't come without their downsides, however. Despite measures such as high pay to prevent such happenings, desertion was extremely high. If the North Africans weren't led by competent officers, then disaster could ensue. Franco spent his early days laying awake at night with a pistol, worried about his own men. He need not have worried. He quickly won them over, and almost immediately in June, Franco and his men had pacified the area between Ceuta and Tetuan. In the following year of 1914, Morocco remained rather quiet, whilst the young men of Europe tore each other to shreds in the fields of France and Belgium. In the few skirmishes there was, however, Franco made quite the name for himself, especially in terms of his mastery of logistics and discipline. Franco demanded a lot of his men, but he made sure he kept himself up to the same standards, and as a result, they deeply respected him. Lieutenant Franquito, as he was known, came to appreciate the hard life under the African sun. He had acquired a newfound confidence and a lot of respect from all across the board, even though he didn't make many personal friends due to his characteristic reserved personality. 1915 was a similarly impressive year, which brought victory after victory. Franco was duly promoted to captain for his efforts, the youngest in all of the Spanish army at the age of 22. By now, the Moroccans had begun to refer to his baraka, aka his luck in combat. He led from the front, yet was seemingly never touched by enemy fire, despite the fact that Regulars officers suffered by far the highest casualty rates of anyone in the Spanish army. Of the 42 officers assigned to them in 1912, only 7 were still alive in 1915. Allah protects him, his troops said. The following year, a huge revolt broke out with German backing. Their aim was for it to spread and cause chaos in French Morocco. The Spanish responded with the largest military operations so far in Morocco, and Franco's men formed part of the main column. 2 units tried to assault the main enemy position, but they were repelled with brutal losses. Franco and his company then stepped up to the task, and they prevailed in hand-to-hand combat, which led to an enemy retreat. The man himself picked up a rifle from one of his fallen soldiers and began firing at the enemy, but immediately afterwards was hit in the abdomen by a machine gun bullet. Despite this, his men pushed on and won the day for him. 56 of the 133 men in their unit had become casualties. His daughter later recalled his injury, quote, "He was extremely lucky because in those days to have a perforated intestine, as was initially feared, was fatal and you died. He used to tell me how he said to his Moroccan aide that it did not feel too bad and that he continued to breathe normally, and it was a nice sunny day. When medical personnel reached him, however, they said, 'No, not this one. He's gut shot. No point in evacuating him to the medical truck. He'll die shortly.' My father then said to his Moroccan assistant that he did not at all feel like he were dying and had no intention of dying on such a nice day. He told him, 'Grab your gun,' and pointed at those chaps until they get me back to the truck. And that's what happened. If he had not been so determined, they would have left him to bleed to death. The physicians later told him he had been very lucky. The wound occurred when he had been inhaling, and this raised his organs very slightly, so that the bullet just missed. Though it grazed his liver, it did not hit his intestines. In those days, if you were hit in the intestines, you were a goner. He was very lucky, had a great deal of baraka, as they said over there," end quote. Obviously, Franco survived. It was a close-run thing, and he called for a priest and made confession, but his luck carried him through. Of the 11 wounded who were evacuated with him, 7 died shortly afterwards. Franco was recommended for promotion and received a telegram personally thanking him in the name of the king. While still recovering, his estranged parents even reunited just to come and visit him in Ceuta at the infirmary. After 4.5 years in Morocco, Francisco was finally granted some leave, and he returned home with his mother for 3 months before reuniting with his unit in November. In February 1917, he was promoted to Major at the age of 24 and given the Cross of Maria Cristina, First Class, a very prestigious award. Shortly after this, though, he was returned to mainland Spain, where he was to supervise training of reserve officers in Oviedo. For the first time in a long time, Franco had frequent free time, and he became a familiar figure in the city as he took to riding a horse through the quiet streets. He came to be known as El Comandantin, aka the Little Major. The reference meant both his youth and his small stature, but mostly the former by this point. It was here in Oviedo that he met a 15-year-old girl named Carmen Polo, the daughter of a rich retiree. The two met on a country outing in summer 1917, and Franco was immediately taken in by her, especially her piety. This wasn't going to be an easy romance, however, as Carmen's father was a progressive man who wasn't the biggest fan of military types, and he certainly didn't want one wooing his daughter. Franco's daughter recalls, quote, "Her father decided to put her in a cloistered convent. My father could only communicate in short letters. The only way to her was when they came every morning for communion, because they all left the convent for the big church, open to the public. There, my father could see her every morning at the 7 a.m. Mass. Then he returned home and went back to bed for a little while." End quote. Franco's persistence did eventually pay off. Even the nuns were deeply impressed by his punctual appearance every day at 7 a.m, and eventually the two were allowed to exchange a few letters and even to have a few chaperoned meetings. Their relationship began to blossom, no matter the difficult circumstances. Eventually, after a few years had passed, her father had to face reality, and Franco was allowed to visit the family home and achieve a sort of understanding. The girl was allowed to visit Franco's parents, and Franco's mother described her as a fairy tale princess. Back in Morocco, things weren't going well, and Lieutenant Colonel Astre proposed that an elite foreign legion of volunteers be created, based on the French model, to control the area. In 1920, his idea was approved, and Astre chose Franco to be his second in command. After 3 months of hesitation, Franco accepted. His boring 3 years in Oviedo had come to an end, where the only real high point had been his pursuit of Carmen Polo, and she was by now firmly committed to him, her father agreeing to their engagement in 1920. In October, Franco headed off to his new assignment, which would take up most of his time for the next 5.5 years. Despite the name, the majority of the legion were just ethnic Spaniards, and the group quickly became famous as the best of the best that the Spanish army had to offer under Astre and Franco's leadership. Many of the men came from extremely questionable backgrounds, yet Franco was able to keep them in line, given that discipline was his specialty. In this aspect, he was ruthless. He was told that executions could only be carried out via official court-martials. In the early days of the Legion, a volunteer threw a hissy fit and threw his plate of rations on the ground, splattering an officer. Franco had him executed on the spot and ordered the entire battalion to march past the dead body. Franco then wrote to his superiors explaining the situation and took total responsibility. They didn't complain about the lack of a court-martial, and he made his point. In 1921, the Rif War suddenly exploded. The eastern zone of Spanish Morocco completely collapsed, and the insurgents were essentially at the gates of Melilla. 10,000 Spanish troops had perished, and another 1,000 soon died in captivity. 500 more remained in insurgent hands. This was Spain's greatest disaster since their thrashing at the hands of the Americans in 1898. In the early days of the Rif War, the entire front collapsed like a pack of cards. Many of the Regulars units simply killed their Spanish officers, and most of them simply deserted. The Spanish had relied far too heavily on the locals, and even the Madrid government had only ever made a half-arsed effort with Morocco in general. There wasn't enough money and arms to keep the place running, and even then, corruption was so high that the little they did get was just squandered. Most of the 10,000 men who died were killed running away. Many officers had hopped in their cars and fled, leaving their men to their fates. The entire thing was comically bad, far, far worse than Italy's disaster in Ethiopia or the British disaster in Zululand. The Moroccans themselves were brutal beyond belief. Spaniards, unfortunate enough to get captured, were almost certainly doomed. Thousands were tortured and mutilated before their death. Many, as in Moroccan and Arab custom, were beheaded. The Spanish had their limit, however. Franco's unit had to force march 50 kilometers to Tetuan so they could be rushed to Melilla by train and ship. Many of his men ended up dying of exhaustion just trying to get there. The city was shored up, however, and held. A small counteroffensive then followed, with some land being regained. The Legion further established itself as the elite of the Spanish army in the fighting, not that their competition seemed to have been very high quality. General José San Giorgio recommended Franco for promotion to lieutenant colonel in recognition of his leadership during the counteroffensive, but the War Ministry denied him purely due to his age. They awarded him another combat decoration instead. Back home, the initial wave of patriotism had begun to wear off, and by 1922, the left was causing a storm about the conflict. Franco was certain the Freemasons were behind this, and his hatred of them continued to grow. This was a common viewpoint in Catholic nations due to how intertwined Freemasonry was with liberalism, especially during the Enlightenment and French Revolution. The Legion's commander, Milan Astre, too, was furious at the backstabbing going on back home. After recovering from his latest injury, he delivered several rousing speeches in which he praised the army and denounced the critics back home for their lack of patriotism. He was relieved of his command in November 1922. Franco wasn't yet of a high enough rank and couldn't fill his shoes, even though Astre had specifically asked the War Ministry to let him. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Rafael de Valenzuela was brought in to lead the way. Franco took this appointment as a personal insult and asked to return home to the Oviedo garrison. On his way back, he was received across the nation and in the media as a military hero for the first time. In June, he planned to marry Carmen, yet fate intervened, and the Legion's new commander was killed in Morocco. The situation in general wasn't looking good, and Franco was the only logical choice, so off he went, leaving his fiancée terrified that he would suffer the same fate as the previous commanders. Franco was given the long-awaited promotion to go with his new position too. Francisco spent the next few months stabilizing the situation and reforming the Legion. In October 1923, he was able to return to Spain and marry Carmen. King Alfonso VIII himself was best man by proxy. The marriage was the social event of the year, and by now Franco was famous all across the nation. The fact that he had postponed his own marriage earlier that year only added to his mystique. There was a brief honeymoon for the newlyweds, and then off they went to live in Melilla for the next 2.5 years. Carmen spent much of her time with other officers' wives, as Franco spent so much time in the field, and he liked Morocco far more than she did. But regardless, the two got on perfectly well, and there was never a rupture in the marriage, no matter the circumstances. Both were completely devoted to each other. Their daughter recalls, quote, "My father was completely identified with my mother. Yes, they got along very well, and the marriage brought my father a great sense of peace and security. He left in the hands of Mama everything to do with the household and with my education. Papa was completely identified with her," end quote. Throughout the following years, Franco continued to prove his worth despite the difficult political situation. Primo de Rivera had established a military dictatorship, yet he had a reputation as an abandonista when it came to Morocco, and Franco constantly had to argue his corner, and on one occasion tried to hand in his resignation in disgust, which Primo refused to accept. Regardless, in February 1925, he was promoted once again to colonel. That same year, things continued to become more confusing in Morocco, this time for the better. The insurgents had taken their fight to the French too, and eventually the French and the Spanish joined forces. 160,000 French troops moved from the south, while 75,000 Spaniards attacked from the north. The key Spanish operation was an amphibious landing at the bay of Alhucemas, near the heart of the insurgency. The operation launched on the 8th of September 1925 and was a roaring success, with Franco leading the initial force. Steady progress ensued as the Spaniards pressed deep into the enemy's most important regions. By May 1926, El Krim, the rebel leader, surrendered to the French. In 1927, the last pockets of resistance were finally quelled. The Rif War had ended in victory, and Franco had been the key player. Franco would look back on the Rif War as one of, if not the most defining moment of his life, and he would forever bore those around him with endless anecdotes of his time there. For his efforts, he was promoted to Brigadier General on the 3rd of February 1926, making him the youngest general in Europe at 33 years old. He was then transferred back to the mainland and made head of the 1st Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division in Madrid, a prestigious position indeed. He was a little disappointed that his rival, Manuel Goded, was made Chief of Operations in the Protectorate, but Carmen was overjoyed to finally be out of dusty North Africa. Franco was now one of the most famous men in Spain. Ironically, one of the few who was above him in this regard was his own brother, Ramon, who had completed a transatlantic flight to South America, in which he was afterwards compared to a modern-day Columbus. Regardless, Francisco was never jealous, and he became a regular fixture in Madrid society. In 1927, he even personally accompanied the king and queen on an inspection tour of Morocco. The most important moment for Franco during these years, however, was the birth of his first and only child, Carmen, in September 1926. Franco and his wife had a hard time conceiving for a long time, most likely due to his earlier bullet wound, but now they finally had their wish. This was the greatest joy in Franco's life. He later said of his delight, quote, "When the baby girl was born, I almost went crazy," end quote. Franco's daughter would stay by his side for the rest of his life, always living near him. As was typical of the age, however, the rearing of his daughter was mostly left to his wife. Carmen would recall, quote, "He was a very good father, but he did not always deal that much with me, since, as a girl, my upbringing was much more in my mother's hands. This was especially the way it was in that era. He, Mama, and I made up the nuclear family. But if he had major professional or patriotic responsibilities, he would tend to us in the background. Then, when he was not so pressed, he devoted more time to his family," end quote. At first though, Franco did get to spend a lot of time with his new daughter, as his new job was not particularly demanding. He also spent a lot of time reading, and built up an extensive library, which was lost in 1936, when it was looted by revolutionaries in Madrid. During Franco's time in Madrid, Primo de Rivera took a particular liking to him, due to his professionalism and ability to keep his nose clean. The Spanish military was horribly bloated and corrupt, and it was this that Primo set to change, which brought endless trouble and conspiracies from inside the military itself. One reform that Primo set about implementing was the merging of the 4 separate military academies. Previously, there was an infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineer academy. Now, they were all merged into one location to be built in Zaragoza. Franco was the man chosen to lead it, and in December 1927, Franco headed off, soon followed by his family. The new General Military Academy welcomed its first class in autumn 1928. Franco devoted himself to his new role, and he made many great reforms, yet the Spanish military was still tactically backwards in comparison to what was being worked on in the major nations of Europe. When civil war came to Spain, 95% of the former Zaragoza cadets would join Franco's cause. The men adored him, and indeed, for good reason. He had personally wiped away much of the corruption of the past, and made a new system based on his own values, which could be best described as harsh but fair. In May 1929, Zaragoza became the first city in Spain to have a street named after Franco. His life was largely tranquil in Zaragoza, but over the coming years, things were not well. Primo de Rivera was given the boot by the king, despite his accomplishments, and Spain drifted into a period of political chaos. Franco, who had been deep in his reading and had an ever-growing economic and political consciousness, watched with alarm. He saw the cause as internal subversion, mostly by Freemasons and communists. In December 1930, his suspicions were confirmed when a Republican military revolt broke out in Jaca, not far from Zaragoza. Franco immediately armed several companies of cadets with weapons before sending them out to block the highway to the north. The rebellion was a total fiasco and was quickly put down, but not before they murdered 2 civil guards and a general who attempted to negotiate with them. Soon enough, the 2 leading officers in the revolt were court-martialed and executed. Ramon Franco, Franco's brother, was actually involved in the rebellion, but managed to flee to Portugal. Ramon, left without means in Lisbon, contacted his brother asking for money. Franco's brother had been nothing but a liability for years now, and had brought great dishonour upon the family, time and time again. Yet Francisco felt compelled to help him, and sent him 2,000 pesetas. In the correspondence, he begged Ramon to come to his senses and stop being an idiot, before it was too late. He was going down a path that would certainly lead to his demise. On the 27th of December, Franco wrote to a friend about events, quote, "What happened in Jaca was nauseating. The army is full of cuckoos and cowards, so that a crazy extremist can bamboozle his unit in the most contemptible way. They murdered poor General Las Heras in a cowardly manner, just as they did the captain and soldier of the civil guard, firing on him with rifles and a machine gun when he tried to stop them on the road from Jaca. Then, in the face of a smaller force that opened fire, they threw down their arms and tried to change colours. Fortunately, it was demonstrated once more that the ones who behaved well were our old comrades. What a clean-out our army needs," end quote. Things got worse the following year. The collapse of Spain continued, and the king ended up fleeing the country for his life. Although importantly, he did not officially abdicate. He said he would return from exile when his people wanted him to. Soon enough, the Republicans and their extremist allies were at the helm and dragged Spain ever deeper into the abyss. Franco himself was left in disbelief, as he knew full well the majority of the nation supported the crown, even if most of the larger cities did not anymore. He said that he was willing to march in support of the king, yet found little support. He impotently watched events from Zaragoza, viewing the Republican takeover as an unjust usurpation. Symbolically, he refused to lower the monarchist flag at the Academy until he received a written order from Madrid explicitly ordering him to do so. The future looked bleak, however. Franco as a monarchist general in a new Republican Spain. The new government immediately revealed themselves as extreme anti-clericals, and Catholics, aka the majority of the country, were downtrodden in absolutely every aspect of Spanish life. Any resistance to the new regime was crushed, and the monarchists and conservatives were unable to organise themselves in such a situation. Underground, however, there was a steady revival of traditional Catholicism in opposition to the new far-left government. The Carlists in the north, especially, underwent a rapid revival. Payne describes the state of Spain during these first few years of the Republic. Quote, "For 2 years, the Republican coalition devoted itself to an extensive reform program dealing with the military, labor and trade unions, regional autonomy, education, land reform, and restrictions on the Catholic Church. The land reform was confused, but generally moderate, and a statute of Catalan autonomy was passed in 1932, leading to a new autonomous government in Barcelona. The most divisive and destructive reform was the anti-clerical program, which did not merely separate church and state officially for the first time in Spain's history, but moved to crush Catholic education, outlawing all teaching by the clergy, and also prosecuting Catholics in numerous petty ways that violated freedom of expression and conscience. Aznar acknowledged that such a policy was not liberal, but the left claimed that this was the only way to put the Catholic Church in its place, and it insisted that the large Catholic sector of the population must play no role of any influence whatsoever in government, unless it were willing to abandon its beliefs and values." End quote. At the end of 1931, after a long list of other military reforms that had already been implemented, Franco's General Military Academy was completely closed down by the new government. The government was outspoken in its dislike of the military, and very quickly a spirit of resentment grew up in the military itself in return. Aznar had in fact openly said that he wanted to, quote, "pulverize the army." During Franco's farewell speech, he refused to utter the words "Viva la Repubblica," and indeed, the words never left his mouth on any occasion, and he was later very proud of that fact. He would always insist on "Viva España" instead. The depressed Francisco left his post with tears in his eyes. This was the biggest blow he had suffered since his injury, all the way back in 1916. Aznar was absolutely livid about the speech, and Franco was then put under police surveillance, despite Franco stating that he had no interest in acting against the government in a personal interview. For the next 8 months, Franco was left out to dry with no assignments, so he lived at his wife's family home in Asturias. Now, essentially, politics had come to Franco's life, as opposed to Franco coming to politics. From here on out, he was inherently political, and always considered the political aspect of any action he made beforehand. By February 1932, Aznar felt that the new government was solidified, and thus safe from men such as Franco. He didn't want to further agitate such men, and Francisco finally got a posting, this time as commander of the 15th Infantry Brigade at La Coruña, near his hometown of El Ferrol. Perhaps this was the correct move by the Republic, as Franco carefully avoided playing any part in the disaster that was the San Giorgio Revolt in August 1932. The time simply wasn't ripe for a conservative military rebellion yet, and Franco had no interest in partaking in one in general. His position was clear. He regretted the fall of the monarchy, but he would do his very best for the Republic as a professional, whatever his disagreements with their insane policies. The following year, supposedly for Franco's loyalty, he was given a more important appointment, although in a less than prestigious location. Franco was made military commander of the Balearic Islands, and whilst on paper this was a step up, in reality, Aznar wrote in his diary that it was good to keep Franco away from Madrid. Mussolini's Italy had supposedly shown interest in the islands, and Franco's new task was to improve the defences there. The military attaché in Paris recommended a Spanish officer who was currently studying there, named Luis Carrero Blanco, to help Franco, and together they drew up plans for the islands. Franco was left deeply impressed by Blanco, and the government approved their ideas, although the implementation was suffocated by budgetary restrictions. Overall though, this was a discouraging period for Franco. He had little to do, and his meteoric rise had clearly come to a halt. His distaste for the new Spain grew and grew, and he threw himself into his books again, reading more than he had in all the previous years combined, especially about politics, economics, and international affairs. All of this learning further solidified Franco's view that the West was being eroded from within by a left-liberal Freemasonic conspiracy. Franco wasn't much of an anti-Semite. He disliked them insofar as they contributed to international capitalism, but other than that, he wasn't anywhere near Hitler's level. There was only 4,000 Jews in Spain, so there wasn't much to hate in general. Franco took note of the Phalange's founding in 1933, but he saw the far-right approach as doomed to fail in its current form. They were too extreme for him anyway, at least for now. Also in 1933, the government was shaky, and a strong reaction took place against the government. Lerroux was appointed Prime Minister and quickly offered Franco, who was seen as reliable rather than a fanatical monarchist, the post of Minister of War. Franco, however, politely declined, most likely because he believed the Lerroux government was also doomed to fail, which turned out to be correct. Later in the year, the Ceda Party, the greatest opposition in Spain at the time, offered Franco a place on their electoral list of Madrid, but he declined this also. Franco was serious about his remaining out of politics, but he also wasn't stupid. He took note of everything going on, and the way that Spain was progressing, or rather, regressing. In late 1933, Franco met his father for the first time in 17 years. Here, Francisco urged his father to give up his sinful ways and leave his current wife. Nicholas, of course, didn't take this advice, and the relationship remained strained. They would meet the next year, though, as Franco's mother stopped by in Madrid on her way to fulfill her lifelong dream of visiting Rome. Whilst there, though, disaster struck, and she died from pneumonia. Franco said it was the greatest grief of his entire life. Afterwards, Nicholas Franco met his children to address problems regarding the family estate, but he acted arrogantly. The hostility remained between father and son until Nicholas's death 8 years later. Whilst in Madrid, the new Minister of War wanted to meet his most famous general, and indeed, Hidalgo was more than impressed. Franco was immediately promoted to Major General, the highest rank in the army, at the age of 41. In general, 1934 was a year of endless leftist revolutionary violence. Abortive insurrection followed abortive insurrection. Franco continued to watch with increasing concern. In June, Hidalgo met Franco once more to review the defences in the Balearics. He would write soon afterwards, quote, "I first met the general in Madrid in February, but only really became acquainted during my 4-day visit to the Balearics, when I became even more convinced that he fully merited his reputation. He possesses all the military virtues to the highest degree. His intelligence, his capacity for work, his culture and understanding are always devoted to the service of the army. His greatest talent is his steady deliberation in examining, researching, analysing, and dealing with problems. But his deliberation does not keep him from being very detailed and exact in his service, precise in observation, firm in discipline, and demanding, though also calm, understanding, and decided. He is one of the few men I know who never rambles on. My conversations with him in the islands about military affairs revealed his extraordinary knowledge. In the silence of his office, Franco has devoted the 8 years of his peacetime assignments to study and preparation. This has borne fruit, so that there are scarcely any secrets to him in the art of warfare. He is not the most eloquent talker, but he can analyse problems, passing from theory to practice and concrete cases, ranging from weaponry to all the issues that affect soldiers and their morale." End quote. In late 1934, all hell broke loose. Socialists launched a gigantic insurrection on a previously unheard of scale, both in terms of size and in terms of violence. In Catalonia, the revolt was crushed by the garrisons, but in Asturias, the revolutionaries managed to take control of most of the region. Terror ensued, and the clergy especially was targeted. Franco was chosen by Hidalgo to put down the revolt. Martial law was declared, and for 10 days, he slept in his office in the War Ministry in Madrid. Franco took the threat entirely seriously, and in his mind this was the beginning of a communist revolution, launched in league with their masters in Moscow. Franco chose his ever-reliable Moroccans and Foreign Legion units for the task, and his old comrade, Juan Yargue, was put in command of them. The revolutionaries had murdered between 50 and 100 people in cold blood, many of them teenage seminary students. There was no question of the revolution being put down peacefully now that they had effectively declared war on innocent Catholic Spaniards. Yargue's troops retook Oviedo and pushed the rebels into their base in the mining district. Summary executions were common, although only one victim was ever identified, strangely enough. Eventually, the rebels surrendered, and Franco stayed in Madrid until 1935 to organise the pacification efforts. Spain, however, would never be the same. Society was now polarised to an absolutely unprecedented level. It was clear that this wouldn't be the last major political violence that Spain would have to endure. Franco, meanwhile, refused to join any of the various badly organised right-wing insurrections being planned behind the scenes. Early 1935 was a period of intense political drama. 15,000 of the revolutionaries had been arrested and hundreds were prosecuted under martial law, yet the left-wing government intervened to protect them. Although far more death sentences were handed out, only 2 ever actually ended up happening, as the left-wing government intervened to save the rebels in the name of reconciliation. The right, quite rightly, was absolutely horrified. The largest uprising in Europe that decade had just been put down, and the culprits were barely being punished. The entire ordeal was an absolute farce. Justice was dead in Spain. Franco understood the situation better than anyone. He told the Italian chargé d'affaires that any failure to punish the insurrectionists would simply, quote, encourage an early extremist response, end quote. He couldn't have been more right. After all the controversy, Hidalgo was replaced by Lerroux as Minister of War. Franco was now being hailed by the moderate right as the saviour of the Republic, and a higher role was now expected of the man. Lerroux wanted him to become the new High Commissioner of the Moroccan Protectorate, but Prime Minister Zamora intervened, and he was instead appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the military forces there. Either way, Franco was happy. This was perhaps the most important assignment in the Spanish army in his eyes, although his wife was less than happy having to go back to Africa. On the 5th of March, Franco's train left Madrid, where a huge crowd of civilians and military figures arrived to see him off. Here, Franco set a great example and attended Mass every Sunday, which triggered his subordinates to do the same. Franco also got on brilliantly with the civilian administration there, and things were as rosy as could be. Most importantly, Franco tightened up the administration of the combat units and improved his personal relations with their officers. Little did he know how important this would be a year later. Regardless, Franco was in his element. His reunion with Morocco wouldn't last long, however, as Gil Robles, leader of the Ceuta party, was made Minister of War, and he chose Franco as Chief of Staff of the army. Franco didn't particularly want to accept, as he felt he could do more by getting the best of the Spanish army up to scratch in Morocco, but under unrelenting pressure from every angle, he was made to accept, and the Franco family headed back to Spain. Robles later wrote of Franco at this time, quote, "The officers of his generation were impressed by a series of qualities that invested him with undeniable prestige. There was his courage, less theatrical than that of certain other companions in the Moroccan campaigns, but which, after being subjected to the decisive test of fire on numerous occasions, became legendary. Foresight and sure instinct that enabled him to measure the strength of an enemy in order to attack coldly when it was weakened. The cult of discipline, which he did not hesitate to sustain with means as harsh as might be necessary, though without failing to watch over the well-being of his troops with extreme care and striving to avoid wasting lives in combat. Careful preparation of operations, indispensable in a colonial campaign, where it is more important to avoid dangerous improvisations than to develop grand strategic concepts. Exact knowledge of the enemy's weak points in the material and in the moral order. Avoidance of any kind of dissipation that might distract him from achieving his goals. Maturely conceived and implacably pursued. All this contributed to surrounding Franco with a special aura that was recognized by his friends and enemies, and to create a zone of isolation and reserve about him that enhanced his reputation." End quote. The Robles-Franco partnership did not last long, however, as by the end of the year, the government was voted down and a period of chaos ensued as a new government wasn't able to be formed. The president just kept appointing personal cronies as prime minister, who inevitably failed after a short period, even though Robles, under the rules of the system, should have been made PM long ago. In the short time the two had together, though, they worked wonders with the army, and Franco made some genuinely great changes, although he didn't get enough time to overhaul the entire armed forces. After this, Franco again refused to get involved with two more ridiculous insurrection plans, one that Robles was wrapped up in, and another that Jose Antonio, son of Primo de Rivera, was wrapped up in. Meanwhile, new elections were called for the 16th of February. 1935 had seen a lull in political violence, but 1936 was a different animal entirely. On election day, at least 37 people died in various incidents, and this was just the start. Rumours of a military coup increased by the day, and the situation rapidly became untenable. Very few believed the election results, as there had been so much obvious interference and outright violence at the polls of all kinds. Leftist mobs had even broken into a number of prisons and released violent revolutionaries from the 1934 uprising during the day's chaos. Spain was on fire. In the lead up to the election, Franco did his best to avoid entangling himself in any of these counterplots against the Republic, as he always did, but it was becoming harder and harder. His name was often invoked, no matter how hard he tried, and he was beginning to be viewed with increasing suspicion by the far-left government. The government was so worried about Franco and his influence that the chief of police was made to seek assurances from Franco, who promised on his word of honour that he would not get involved in any plot, so long as there was no, quote, danger of communism in Spain, end quote. Franco meant every word. On election day itself, Franco stayed up late and became so alarmed as the reports flooded in that he called up the director of the Civil Guard and suggested that a declaration of martial law might be necessary. Franco woke up the elderly General Nicolas Malero and told him that they must take the initiative with convincing the government to declare martial law. Clearly, Franco still had some naive hopes that the far-left government could behave legally. After this, he went to bed. Gil Robles, meanwhile, was up all night long getting the reports regarding election interference. At 7 a.m, Robles had Franco woken up. The entire country was in shock. The government was just letting the left release criminals from jails and interfere with the elections. Franco said as much to his fellow sympathetic generals and urged them to declare martial law in their districts again, which they would have been well within their rights to do so. The general consensus, however, was that most district commanders were unwilling to act without a national decree being issued. Many ministers, however, agreed with Franco, and in some provinces, the process of declaring martial law was beginning to go into effect, but the president personally stepped in and vetoed the order. On the 18th, Generals Goded, Fanjul, and Rodriguez del Barrio conferred with Franco, insisting that the army must be willing to act on its own in this chaotic situation. Franco, as always, declared that the conditions were not yet adequate. In the end, the interim government collapsed, and despite the obvious interference, Manuel Lozana, leader of the Popular Front, was to lead a new government before the electoral process was even complete. The Popular Front was then able to declare its own victory at the polls, bringing to a close an absolute farce of an election. Over the coming months, they further secured the majority by simply not allowing the right to stand in rerun elections, and they arbitrarily assigned seats to themselves. On the third day of the Azana government's existence, they made major changes to the military in order to get conservative commanders out of the way. Franco was made military commander of the distant Canary Islands, General Mola was packed off north to Navarre, and Goded was sent to the Balearics. Franco was livid at the loss of his position of Chief of Staff, and he protested profusely to both Azana and Zamora, but both said they didn't share his concerns about things getting out of control, and so off he went to the Canaries, on what rightly seemed to be a banishment. Both men would later end up agreeing that Franco was right. On the 8th, before his departure, Franco attended a meeting with some key conservative military men, some of them retired, at the home of a Seda leader. Here they agreed to form a council of generals who would remain in Madrid with the goal of, quote, preparing a military movement to prevent the ruin and dismemberment of the patria, end quote, which, quote, would only take action if circumstances made it absolutely necessary, end quote. A memorandum drawn up stated, quote, following the initiative of Mola, insisted upon by Franco, it is agreed that the movement be exclusively for Spain, without any specific political colouring. After triumphing, it will face such problems as the character of the new regime, etc. End quote. The leader was to be General San Giorgio, currently in exile near Lisbon. Francisco Franco, who kept his nose clean for so many years, was now officially part of a military conspiracy. Importantly, however, Franco explicitly stated that a political crisis was not enough to launch such a rebellion. A national breakdown, or threat of revolution from the left, had to take place first. In his depressing exile, Franco considered asking for some extended leave, which would have seen him wait out the crisis, rather than taking an active part in it, but his family talked him out of it. He then dutifully went about his assignment, but kept a very close eye on events back home. Franco, however, was essentially a prisoner. He was under constant police surveillance, his mail was opened, and his phone was tapped. The only way he was able to communicate with the other conspirators was by personal courier, and so, as a result, communications were extremely intermittent. Everyday life in the Canaries was even less exciting than life in the Balearics had been. Franco worked during the morning, but his afternoons were mostly spent playing golf or learning English. He had 3-hour-long lessons per week with an English lady who lived on the island. By April, the council of mostly retired generals in Madrid had proved useless, and so, as a result, Emilio Mola took up the mantle as leader of the revolt. In his northern exile, he quickly won over the Carlists and effectively had the best non-military support he could possibly hope for on his side. Franco and Mola didn't have any close ties, but they were both Africanistas and thus shared a mutual respect. By the end of May, General San Giorgio sent word from Portugal that he accepted Mola's role as head of the revolt. Things were slowly beginning to take shape. Franco's role, however, was far less certain. Over and over again, he would state that the time wasn't right and that the situation might sort itself out. He knew full well how badly all the previous results had gone and felt that this was a last resort, not something to be rushed. A monarchist general named Luis Orgas, also in on the conspiracy, was exiled to the Canaries by the government in mid-April, and when he got there he chastised Franco for being so evasive. The other plotters wondered whether just to launch the operation without him. San Giorgio especially wanted to just go without Franco, as he was still mad about Francisco's lack of support for his own abortive revolt 4 years earlier. He was quoted as saying, quote, no matter what, with Franquito or without Franquito, we will save Spain, end quote. Spain had recently begun to hold American-style beauty pageants, and one of the plotters in Pamplona with Mola joked that Franco's nickname should be Miss Canary Islands 1936, because he was acting like a woman rather than dedicating himself like a man. Mola himself, however, knew how important Franco was. If Franco joined the cause, then many others would too. Franco's prestige would be one of the most important factors in the revolt's success. On the 23rd of June, Franco's mind still wasn't made up, and he took the bewildering step of writing to the new Prime Minister, Quiroga, about the, quote, state of anxiety produced in army officers by the government's latest military measures, end quote. He explained that the army was loyal, but simply wanted fair treatment. It was essentially a long letter, worded like a last call to reason, in which he spoke in extremely friendly terms as a man who genuinely didn't want the country to devolve into political violence. Quiroga didn't even bother reading it, never mind replying to it. After the Civil War broke out, Franco would make the text of this letter public to show everyone how he had tried to solve things amicably. In the letter, his claims about the army's loyalty were absolutely true. Mola himself counted on no more than 12% of officers joining the revolt. Most of the army were completely loyal to the government, but were just disgusted with their treatment. The longer the government kept up their antics, the higher Mola's estimate would inevitably become. Meanwhile, planning continued, and Mola was losing his head. He considered retiring and fleeing abroad, but the others convinced him to stay the course. Everyone knew how unlikely victory was, but they wanted to risk it nonetheless, for their beloved Spain, and many for their Catholic faith. By now, most had given up hope that they could seize power in a coup, and the current vision was a few weeks-long civil war, where troops from loyal provinces would converge on the capital. By June, Mola was convinced that victory was only possible with the help of the elite units in Morocco, and Franco became even more indispensable. Franco, of course, knew all along how vital these units were, who were so close to his heart. By the last days of June, Franco was offered command of the absolutely vital units in Morocco, and he tentatively agreed to participate in the revolt, even though he did change his mind once more before the big day. Firstly, there was the question of how to actually get him to Morocco. On the 5th of July, arrangements were put into motion to charter a foreign plane for him. Meanwhile, in Spain, the population was growing daily more fed up with the government. Jose Antonio's phalange, which had effectively been a non-factor in the latest election, was now ballooning. Violence was commonplace, land was being seized, churches were being burned, pornography filled the shelves, jails were emptied, and the country simply did not function. Barcelona's La Vanguardia newspaper wrote on the 10th of June, quote, how many votes did the fascists have in Spain in the last election? None, a ridiculously small amount. Today, on the other hand, travellers returning from different parts of the country are saying, there, everybody is becoming a fascist. What kind of change is this? What has happened? What has happened is simply that it is no longer possible to live, that there is no government. In such a situation, people instinctively look for a way out. What is the new political form that radically represses all these insufferable excesses? A dictatorship, fascism, and thus, almost without wanting to, almost without realizing it, people begin to feel themselves fascist. They know nothing about all the inconveniences of a dictatorship, which is natural. They will learn about these later on, when they have to suffer them, end quote. Payne describes the situation on the eve of the military revolt. Quote, the frequent overt violations of the law, assaults on property, and political violence in Spain were without precedent for a modern European country not undergoing total revolution. These included massive, sometimes violent and destructive strike waves, large-scale illegal seizures of farmland in the south, a wave of arson and destruction of property, arbitrary closure of Catholic schools, seizure of churches and church property in some areas, widespread censorship, thousands of arbitrary arrests, virtual impunity for criminal action by members of the Popular Front parties, manipulation and politicization of justice, arbitrary dissolution of rightist organizations, coercive elections in Cuenca and Grenada that excluded all opposition, subversion of the security forces, and a substantial growth in political violence, resulting in more than 300 deaths. Moreover, because local and provincial governments were forcibly taken over, decreed by the government in much of the country, rather than secured via any elections, they tended to have a coercive cast akin to that of local governments overtaken by Italian fascists in northern Italy during the summer of 1922. Yet, as of early July, the centrist and rightist opposition in Spain remained divided and impotent. There had been no revolt against conditions so oppressive that they would already have provoked rebellion in other countries, end quote. On the 11th of July, a chartered plane left London and headed to the Canary Islands to pick up Francisco Franco. Whilst the pilot was en route, however, the ever-cautious Franco continued to hesitate. On the 12th, he sent a message saying, limited visibility, to the other conspirators, which was code, meaning that the conditions were still not right. When this message reached Mola on the 13th, panic ensued as the plotters in Morocco had already been informed that the big day would be the 18th of July. He then ordered San Giorgio to be flown to Morocco from Portugal instead when the time came. They were going to go, with or without Franquito. Suddenly though, something changed the minds of not just Franco, but thousands upon thousands of others. Gil Robles was targeted for assassination and survived, but Calvo Sotelo, the monarchist leader, was not so lucky. The police turned up to his door, took him into their custody for questioning, and he was then shot in the head in the van. If the bullet that killed Franz Ferdinand in 1914 was the shot heard around the world, then the bullet that killed Sotelo was the shot heard around Spain. This was it. There was no going back. The left had pushed and pushed and pushed, and now Spain stood as one and said no. When Franco got the news on the 13th, he was absolutely shocked to the core by it, and his mind was totally made up. His conditions that he had set out for years had finally been fulfilled. The nation was falling to lawless revolutionary extremism, and innocent men like Sotelo were being assassinated by their own government. He immediately fired off a message to Mola, stating that he was unequivocally behind the cause, and that the revolt should begin as soon as possible. Franquito was in, for good this time. Franco told his aide to take his wife and daughter on a German steamer to Le Havre in France, and he began to prepare. Donna Carmen was about as devout of a Catholic as one can be, and she was completely in support of her husband's actions, and he kept her fully up to date as events progressed. He felt the odds were still stacked against the rebellion, but he now believed it more dangerous not to rebel than to rebel. At his final English lesson, his teacher said that he looked worried, distracted, and sleep-deprived. The plane sent to pick up Francisco was ready on Gran Canaria, the next island over, and the English pilot, Cecil Bebb, as well as the devout Catholic Major Hugh Pollard, hopped on the ferry and let Franco know that his plane was ready. On the 16th, the Franco family left for the larger island. Here, they attended the funeral of General Amado Balmes, who had recently died of an accident at the range. Afterwards, Franco began to make arrangements for his imminent leap of faith. On the 17th, the plotters rose up in Morocco at 5 p.m. On the 18th, troops seized Las Palmas in Gran Canaria, crushing opposition from leftist workers. The rebels then quickly solidified control over the coming days, and Franco turned over the islands to General Orgaz. Franco's family boarded a Spanish ship for the night, where their identity was kept hidden to everyone except the commanders. Things quickly went wrong. All across Spain, leftist sailors were mutinying and murdering their captains. This ship was no exception. On that same night, some sailors tried their luck, but on this occasion, they failed, and the captain placed them under arrest. It was a very close call. The next day, the Francos were safely on board their German steamer, which was to drop them off at Boyen, near the Spanish border, before it carried on to Le Havre. After an emotional goodbye to his family, Franco headed for the nearby airfield, and off he went with his English pilot at 2 p.m. on the 18th. They stayed in Casablanca for the night, and those that saw Franco said he looked as if he was in a state of unaccustomed excitement. He stayed up for most of the night, talking to those around him about the changes that must take place in Spain, when they were successful. Early the next morning, the plane took Franco to Tetuan, capital of the Spanish Protectorate. Franco couldn't be sure exactly how well things had gone in Morocco, but was immediately reassured as he spotted key conspirators when his plane landed. Immediately, the crowds along the runway burst into passionate applause, and Franco was welcomed with open arms to take command of the best of the Spanish army. A journalist had joined Franco in the plane to Morocco, and he was then ordered by Franco to continue on with the plane to Marseille, and then to Rome, where he was to petition Mussolini for planes and other military supplies. Meanwhile, all over Spain, revolt was breaking out to varying degrees. The most secure area by far was the north with Mola, but other isolated pockets existed all over the nation. When the dust had settled, after a few days, the rebels had control of 1/3 of the country. The government still held all of the big industrial cities, and it quickly became apparent that the only hope to keep moving forward would lie with Franco and his elite units in Morocco. There was a major problem with this reality. The strait was blockaded by the navy, which was firmly in Republican hands. The only way across was by air, and Franco initiated the first airlift in history, albeit at an extremely slow pace, as he had only 7 small and outdated planes at his disposal. Francisco once again looked abroad, and he asked the Italian and German consuls in Tangier for support. On the 23rd, he commandeered the only Lufthansa passenger plane in the area, and he sent his representatives to personally seek assistance from Adolf Hitler. Days earlier, the leader of the revolt, Sanjurjo, died in a plane crash on the way to join up with his fellow plotters. Franco now had an even larger role to play. On the 25th of July, Franco's emissaries finally tracked down Hitler at the Wagner Festival in Beirut, and after a 2-hour conversation, he was completely and utterly on board, and believed that the Spaniards were friends of Nazi Germany and combating communism. He immediately pledged even more support than Franco had asked for. A day and a half later, Mussolini came to the same conclusion, mostly due to Mola's emissaries rather than Franco's, but either way, Mussolini sent some planes and other arms directly to Franco in the south. By the end of the first week of August, Franco had 15 Junkers transport planes and a couple dozen other assorted planes from the Germans and Italians. Throughout the rest of the month, Franco's elite troops began to flood over the strait, and by the end of September, 21,000 men had made the journey, along with 350,000 kilos of arms and supplies by air alone. In the north, Mola's advance on Madrid had stalled, but now the best of the Spanish army had entered the fray. Franco was now de facto, although not de jure, the most important rebel commander. On the 7th of August, Franco moved his headquarters to Seville so he could be nearer his troops who were making their great trek north towards the capital. Days later, Franco's troops linked up with Mola's. A small rediversion occurred to secure the border with Portugal, who was actively providing logistical support to the rebels, and then the march on Madrid continued once more. Franco's columns were massively outnumbered, yet they triumphed with ease. The Republican forces were fanatical left-wing militia units who had mostly never seen combat in their life, as well as some small police and army units. Franco's elite troops would simply stage a head-on attack, fix the enemy in place, and then perform a flanking maneuver, which would more often than not send the enemy into a headlong retreat, and result in a resounding victory. This was repeated again and again, and the Republicans, seemingly, never learned. The advance, however, was slow. Franco never did anything in a hurry, and this was no exception. He took his time, shored up all the fronts, secured his flanks, and built up a logistics system from scratch. Meanwhile, repression was brutal on both sides. In the leftist zone, it was totally out of control, and the victims tended to be innocent civilians. The clergy especially underwent what could only be described as a genocide if they were an ethnic group. In the nationalist zone, things were much more organised and methodical, yet brutal nonetheless. Those who did not join the revolt did so at their own peril, and were seen as traitors to Spain. As Franco's columns neared Madrid, he issued the following ominous proclamation, quote, "If this suicidal resistance continues, if the people of Madrid do not force the government and its Marxist leaders to surrender the capital unconditionally, we reject any responsibility for the great destruction that we shall be obliged to carry out to overcome this suicidal stubbornness. Be warned, citizens of Madrid, that the greater the resistance, the more harsh will be our punishment." End quote. At first, the new regime seemed open to interpretation. Mola wanted to maintain the separation of church and state, and most generals were happy to respect the way the country had been set up prior to the rigged elections of that year. Franco, however, had other ideas. At first he towed the line, but soon enough he completely contradicted himself and spoke his mind. On the 10th of August, he said the following to a Portuguese journalist, quote, "Spain is republican and will continue to be so. Neither the flag nor the regime has changed. The only change is that crime is replaced by order, and acts of banditry by honest and progressive work." End quote. In the very same interview, he then said, quote, "Spain will be governed by a corporative system, similar to those installed in Portugal, Italy, or Germany." End quote. A few days later, he admitted that there might be a dictatorship, but only a brief one to restore order. All of this barely mattered, however, as the people themselves knew what they wanted. The most important things to Spaniards immediately rose to the forefront. This was patriotism, tradition, and religion. The Catholic aspect especially became more important, as the mass murder of the clergy became common knowledge. Soon enough, the Republican cause was viewed as a crusade, no different to that of the great Catholic crusades in the Holy Land. Franco, a devout Catholic himself, was more than happy with these developments. On the 15th of August, Franco openly broke with the Republican vision that the other generals had. At the Feast of the Assumption in Seville, he unilaterally replaced the Republican flag with the traditional red and yellow banner of the monarchy, and he hailed it as the true flag of Spain, for which Spanish patriots had given their lives in hundreds of battles. This move was then followed all across the nationalist zone. It was clear that no matter what Mola and the others thought, Franco was the top dog here. The Italians, Germans, and Portuguese had already established this as fact anyway, and it was Franco they dealt with and viewed as Spain's natural leader. Mola wasn't that upset about developments. He had never really seen himself as a leader, and on the 16th, he and Franco met in Burgos to discuss planning and coordination. Mola was entirely cooperative and raised no complaints regarding Franco's growing preeminence. By now, Franco even had a sort of political staff surrounding him. He had a monarchist politician who acted as his foreign affairs expert. He had his brother, Nicholas, as his chief political consultant. He had two senior generals, including an Air Force commander in his entourage, as well as others including Joan March, the multi-millionaire businessman who provided invaluable financial assistance in the early days of the war. Franco even got his own commander, General Astre, founder of the Legion, to act as his propaganda chief. This was an incredibly important role by now, as foreign support meant everything if the civil war was to drag on like it now appeared that it would. In September, the nationalists seemed unstoppable. Mola gained the initiative in the north, and Franco's forces took Talavera, just over 100 kilometers from Madrid. The spirit of optimism amongst the revolutionary left quickly turned to complete alarm and terror. Franco did not know it yet, but the Republicans were about to end their string of defeats. The Soviets had begun to send masses of arms, advisors, tanks, tank crews, planes, and pilots, and had organised the international brigades, which saw thousands of revolutionaries from across Europe flock to Spain to join the cause. Regardless, Franco's columns pushed ever closer to Madrid. On the 21st of September, there was a meeting between the leading generals, and the question regarding leadership came to the forefront. Kinderlan, a close friend of Franco's and the leader of the Air Force, left the only written account. Quote, "During the morning session, which lasted 3.5 hours, we discussed various items of importance, but none as important as that of the Mando Unico. I pointed this out 3 times without managing to bring the issue to discussion, despite having been actively supported by General Orgaz. I seemed to notice, with disappointment, that my goals were not shared by the majority of those assembled. When the afternoon session began at 4, I firmly introduced the question, without the slightest hesitation, encountering hostile reception from various members. General Cabanellas was clearly and decidedly opposed, declaring that to him the question still seemed premature, and that it was not necessary that a unified command be led by a single person, since there were 2 ways to direct a war, by a generalissimo, or by a directory or junta. I agreed, adding, "There are indeed 2 methods of directing a war. With the first you win, with the second you lose." My proposal was finally put to a vote, and was approved with only General Cabanellas dissenting. Then came the vote on the name of the person who should be named Generalissimo. Since it began with the most junior officers, and the 2 colonels excused themselves because of their rank, I decided to reduce tension and break the ice by asking to vote first, and did so in favour of Franco. My vote was immediately supported by those of Mola, Orgaz, Davila, Quippo Delano, and all the rest, with the exception of Cabanellas, who said that, as an opponent of such a system, it was not up to him to vote for someone for a post he deemed unnecessary. End quote. In late September, Franco's family arrived after a long journey back after their 2 months of seclusion in France. Franco, however, had very little time to spend with them. Around the same time, he made his most momentous decision yet. He chose to divert the march on Madrid in order to liberate the Toledo Alcazar, the huge building in which Franco had trained as a cadet all those years ago. 1,800 men were currently holding firm against all odds in one of the most spectacular episodes of the war. There was little doubt in Franco's mind about what to do. He had to save them. On the 24th, he set off, and by the 27th, the mission was complete. Franco personally came to meet the defenders, and emotional scenes followed. The world had been on the edge of their seats as they listened to the Alcazar story, and now the nationalists were victorious. It was a propaganda victory of gigantic proportions. On the 28th, a second meeting took place. The first had established Franco as military commander-in-chief for the duration of the war, even though no public announcement had been made yet. This meeting, however, was to secure Franco complete political power too. The day before, Yagüe had stood next to Franco on a balcony in front of a cheering crowd and hailed him as the new chief of state. The next day at the meeting, Franco was careful not to push his own candidacy, but to allow his supporters to do it for him. Kinderlan, Nicolas Franco, and Yagüe all argued his case ferociously. It took all day and dragged into the night, but Franco's supporters won out and convinced almost everyone. Franco would be chief of state. On the 1st of October, a ceremony was staged and things became official. Francisco Franco proudly declared, quote, "You are placing Spain in my hands. My grasp will be firm, my pulse will not tremble, and I shall try to raise Spain to the place that corresponds to her history and to her rank in earlier times." End quote. Soon enough, a title emerged for Franco, which was simply the Spanish equivalent of Führer or Duce. In this case, it was Caudillo. From here on out, until the last years of his reign, Franco became the most celebrated figure in Spanish history during the figure's lifetime. He was hailed as Spain's saviour and was adored all across the nation. His propaganda apparatus continued to grow, not that he needed it. The nation was already fully behind him and unified in a new spirit based on Spain's glorious history and Catholicism. Federico de Urrutia summarized this spirit, quote, "This is our ultimate guideline, to be what we were before, rather than the shame of what we have been recently. To kill the dead soul of the 19th century, liberal, decadent, Masonic, materialist and Frenchified, and to fill ourselves once more with the spirit of the 16th century, imperial, heroic, sober, Castilian, spiritual, legendary, and chivalrous." End quote. Franco felt that he personally must set the best example for the Spanish people in this new revival, and he began to attend daily mass in a chapel in his official residence. Father Jose Maria Bullard was appointed his official household chaplain on the 4th of October. Payne writes of Franco's faith, quote, "There had never been any doubt about his Catholicism, though it had received only limited expression when he was a young officer. This had been intensified by his marriage to the pious Donna Carmen, but it was the Civil War that identified him with frequent religious practice." End quote. His niece, whom was no great fan of her uncle, later recalled, quote, "His faith was genuine and no mere accommodation, though his way of understanding the gospel might leave much to be desired and be highly debatable." End quote. As soon as Franco was given power, he took full advantage. Everything was centralized. On the 7th of October, Gil Robles directed all Seda members and their militia units to subordinate themselves to the Caudillo. The Carlists and Phalangists attempted to maintain some form of autonomy, but this didn't last long. In December, Franco closed a newly opened Carlist officer training school as he wanted all to act as one. Manuel Falconde, the Carlist leader, was packed off into exile. On the 21st of December, all right-wing militia was officially united under regular military command. As for domestic affairs, Franco worked miracles. In the Republican zone, the currency spiraled out of control and conditions were dire, yet this was not the case in the nationalist zone. The currency was far more stable, the banks remained profitable, and inflation remained around 10% per year. Coal and steel production actually ended up being raised to a higher level than in peacetime. Wages almost kept up with rising prices, and 30% of the cost of the war was met by taxation during the conflict, which was a better record than any major European nation during the Great War. Things were so good, in fact, that Franco was underprepared for how bad things would be once the war was actually over. In the autumn of 1936, Franco was faced with a serious dilemma. Since the war began, the Falange, which had been a non-factor in the election at the start of the year, was now the biggest political party in Spanish history. Their leader, José Antonio Primo de Rivera, was rotting in a Republican jail and could be executed at any time. This was the one figure who could seriously rival Franco for the top spot, given Primo's famous charisma. It's been suggested that Franco deliberately didn't rescue him and let him die, but the truth is that he did give both assistance and money to the Phalangists for the express purpose of getting him out, whether that be via jailbreak or via bribing the guards. None of these attempts were successful. There was even cooperation with influential figures abroad and the German Navy, yet none of these Phalangist efforts could free their chief, and he was executed in November. The worst that Franco can be charged with is that he didn't try a prisoner exchange of some kind, yet it's doubtful that the Republicans would have been open to such an offer anyway. The news of Primo's death was suppressed for a long time, and Franco was perfectly happy to let the cult of the absent one to continue, as it didn't challenge his power in any way. In the end, a single United State Party was created in April 1937. The Phalange was indeed gigantic, but it was also incredibly disorganized, and the original leaders were long dead. The new leaders lacked talent or prestige and were divided among themselves. Fusion was the only option, and the Spanish traditionalist Phalanx was born as the new state party, which merged the Carlists and the Phalange into one. The creed of the new party was the Phalange's 26 points, but Franco stated that this wasn't a fixed program, and the party would develop on its own as time passed. Quote, "The movement that we lead is precisely this, a movement, more than a program. It will not be rigid or static, but subject, in every case, to the work of revision and improvement that reality may counsel." End quote. The Phalange's fascist salute was made the official salute of the regime, at least until 1945, when it was deemed politically necessary to do away with it. Most weren't happy with this merger, but accepted Franco's action for the greater good. The Carlists were just seemingly happy to be living through such a gigantic Catholic resurgence, as this had been their priority the whole time. 568 Phalangists, however, did end up being arrested for causing trouble after the merger. In the end, though, all of them were released. For the vast majority of people, the war was the top priority, plain and simple. They kept their mouths shut and got on with their job. As the war progressed, the Italians, Germans, and Portuguese intervened to various degrees on the nationalist side, but it was only really the Italians who tried to interfere politically. Mussolini's grand plan was for Spain to become a satellite state with an Italian fascist-based regime. Franco, however, had no such intention of becoming a satellite state, and as for the actual ideology of his new regime, he said it would be uniquely Spanish, although similar to the Portuguese and Italian models. In Spain, the most important factor was to be Catholicism, as opposed to any kind of strict ideology. Franco said in an interview with the New York Times Magazine in December 1937, quote, "Spain has its own tradition, and the majority of the modern formulas that are to be discovered in the totalitarian countries may be found already incorporated within our national past." End quote. If Franco wanted to have a regime at all, however, he had to win the war, and in late 1936, the beginning of his reign began with failure, as the nationalists were unsuccessful in taking Madrid. Troops had been constantly siphoned off elsewhere, and by October, there were as many men protecting Oviedo as there were marching towards the capital. The units in the south were of course better quality though. Oviedo, being so well protected, was classic Franco, and indeed he would adhere to this tactic all throughout the Civil War. Losing territory would result in a serious decline in morale and prestige amongst other problems, and so Franco was happy to be the tortoise rather than the hare. He made sure no secondary front was ever abandoned and no mass retreats were ever called. He never made any really great gambles other than the airlift at the beginning of the war, and Franco was essentially as cautious as they came. Franco's intelligence about the Republicans was never good, and so he had no idea what the Soviets were up to. Soon enough, he would find out, as the advanced Soviet tanks and planes made their presence felt the closer he got to Madrid. The few lightly armoured German and Italian vehicles were simply no match for them. The Republican troops themselves, however, were far too inexperienced to actually work in tandem with the tanks and air support, so the nationalists weren't pushed back, but they certainly couldn't advance very far, or very fast now either. Days after the actual attack on the city began, the Republicans got their hands on the battle plan. The nationalists managed to gain a foothold on the western edge of Madrid, but that was it. The Republicans weren't skilled enough to dislodge them, but they were able to go no further. Stalemate in the centre ensued. The Republicans had achieved their first, and indeed, only major victory of the war. The quick victory that the nationalists had hoped for was officially gone, and both sides settled down and tried to raise massive armies in preparation for a far larger conflict. Most other men in Franco's shoes would have lost their heads, but his icy coolness allowed him to adjust to the new unfavourable circumstances and push ever forwards, never losing sight of the goal. Soviet escalation was met by Italian and German counter-escalation, and soon enough there were tens of thousands of Italian troops fighting on the Spanish side, although they were of dubious quality and Franco didn't really want them there. The Germans, meanwhile, sent a smaller but far more effective unit known as the Condor Legion. The Italians allowed Franco to pay for basically all of his supplies on credit, but Hitler was slightly harsher, always pushing for concessions when it came to raw materials. Franco built up his own forces too, although the army never became a serious modern military force. Jose Salchaga, one of Franco's veteran commanders, wrote in his diary, quote, "Lucky for us that the Reds are worse," end quote. And indeed, they were. The Republicans were winning out in terms of numbers, but when it came to quality, the nationalists had a clear advantage. In early 1937, Franco, and indeed many of his advisors and generals, all agreed that it was time to change strategy, and Madrid was deemed too tough a nut to crack at the moment. Instead, the industrially rich north was to be the new focus. The offensive began on the 31st of March, and Franco's forces quickly triumphed despite having inferior numbers. By mid-June, all of the Basque province of Vizcaya was in nationalist hands, and Franco's position was further simplified when his only military rival, Mola, died in a plane crash on the 3rd. No evidence was ever found of foul play, but there has been much speculation ever since. By the 1st of September, Santander had fallen, and all that remained was Asturias. The assault here began immediately against the fanatical revolutionaries, who saw this as their last stand in the north. Yet even against this tough resistance, the city fell after almost 2 months. The repression that followed the fall of this key revolutionary centre was milder than what was going on at the start of the war, as Franco had attempted to curtail executions, and instead utilised military tribunals so things could proceed legally. Despite all this, around 2,000 executions took place in Asturias, and smaller numbers had taken place in Vizcaya and Santander. The loss of the north was an absolute strategic disaster for the Republicans. A huge chunk of their army had been lost, as well as mountains of equipment, much of which was simply taken by the nationalists. Embarrassingly, half of the 100,000 prisoners taken then became nationalist soldiers themselves. For the first time in the war, the nationalists now had the upper hands in terms of both quality and quantity. The writing was effectively on the wall. It was just a question of how long the war would take to finish. In December, as Franco was preparing a fresh offensive on Madrid, the Republicans launched their own preemptive strike in southern Aragon in the nationalists' most exposed position near Teruel. The entire salient was seized, yet the city itself stubbornly held out. Franco, sticking to his mantra of shoring up every single front and making sure that no areas were surrendered to the enemy, quickly gave up on his preparations for Madrid and headed east to relieve the besieged city. Some of his staff and the Condor Legion commanders were livid, yet Franco knew what he was doing and brushed their criticism aside. By now, he felt he had been placed in this position by God and was extremely unwilling to listen to others. As it turned out, he made the right decision. The defenders of the city did actually end up surrendering on the 8th of January, yet Franco had no intention of letting the Republicans hold it for long. The city was retaken on the 22nd of February as more and more troops were transferred east. He didn't stop here, and he followed through into Aragon itself. The Republicans broke into disarray, and on the 15th of April, 1938, the nationalists reached the Mediterranean, splitting the Republican territory into two. Republican surrender and desertion was commonplace, and the disaster here was almost as bad as the loss of the North the year prior. Things had gone from bad to worse for the Republicans, and a mood of foreboding swept their territory. For some reason though, Franco chose to simply wait after this. Catalonia to the north was basically undefended, and his advisors begged him to keep pushing, yet he did not. Franco instead chose to push south into Valencia through mountainous terrain in a headlong assault. When asked why he chose to do this, Franco came out with a reply that bewildered pretty much everyone around him. He said that he wanted to gain more foreign exchange by controlling the large citrus exports of Valencia. A more accurate suggestion would be that he feared French intervention if he pushed too near to their border with Catalonia, which was always a fear at the back of his mind. After all, the French had come and trashed Spain several times over the past century or so. As for the food issue, Valencia produced a food surplus, whereas Catalonia had a large population which was on the verge of starvation, so perhaps this played some part too. Securing Valencia might also result in a chance to cut off Madrid. As for the actual offensive, Franco and his advisors were taken aback by the firm defence put up by the Republicans so soon after their thrashing in Aragon. Kinderlan, one of Franco's closest advisors, suggested that the offensive be cancelled, yet Franco refused to accept defeat and doggedly pushed on despite heavy losses. The Republicans themselves decided that their situation could only be turned around with some form of offensive victory to raise morale, and on the 24th of July, an offensive was launched across the Ebro River. After a few days, they had secured a foothold of 20 by 40 kilometers, the largest Republican advance of the entire war. The offensive, then, in typical Republican fashion, ran out of steam. They had saved Valencia, for now, but that was about it. Franco, as usual, reacted by halting his current operations and transferred troops over for a counter-offensive. Franco's advisors all suggested that this strategically useless Republican position should simply be bypassed so that they could be cut off and destroyed. Franco, as usual, just blew off anyone else's suggestions, and he began a bloody frontal assault. As the battle raged, the crisis over the Sudetenland was raging in Central Europe. In this mood, Admiral Darlan, head of the French Navy, suggested that the French military should intervene in Spain in a kind of peripheral strategy against Hitler. This was exactly why Franco had so carefully avoided Catalonia, it seemed. The proposal was rejected, but Franco wasn't sure that the French wouldn't change their minds, and it concerned him to no end. In fact, he was so stressed that he fell ill and was confined to his quarters for several days. Meanwhile, his men's morale was sagging, as each and every offensive was stated to be the last push by the nationalists, yet offensive after offensive kept coming. Their own propaganda had boomeranged back at them. The Italians especially were totally demoralized, and Mussolini told his son-in-law, Foreign Minister Ciano, quote, "Write in your book today, August 29th, that I foresee the defeat of Franco. This man either does not know how, or does not want to wage war. The Reds are fighters. Franco, no." End quote. Ciano chimed in too, quote, "Franco had no vision of synthesis in war. His operations are those of a magnificent battalion commander." End quote. At the end of September, Neville Chamberlain perhaps saved Franco's cause by putting an end to the European crisis when he allowed the Sudeten Germans to return home. The British also suggested that Franco declare neutrality in any larger crisis, which he happily did. As for the war, by mid-November, despite brutal fighting, the Republicans were pushed back across the river. Franco had suffered 30,000 casualties, but the Republicans had suffered even more. It was a bloodbath for a strategically useless chunk of territory. The Republicans, however, were unable to resupply their battered units, while the Nationalists could. With international complications at an end, Franco invaded Catalonia in December, and his men were at the French border by mid-February 1939. The Republican government fled into exile, and all the Republican cause had left was its territory in the southeast quarter of Spain. Resistance was by now effectively futile, and very few had any hope left in victory. On paper, the Republican army was still large, yet many of those were new draftees who were poorly trained and terribly armed. Stanley Payne describes how Franco brought the war to a close. Quote, "During February, Franco's intelligence agents entered into negotiations with some of the key Republican military leaders who were opposed to Negrin and sought to overthrow communist influence. They assumed, rather naively, that as professional military men, they could negotiate more lenient terms of surrender with Franco. In fact, he was implacable, insisting, as he had throughout, on unconditional surrender, promising only that Republicans not guilty of crimes would not be prosecuted, and that the leaders would be allowed to flee abroad. When he finally opened his offensive of victory on the Madrid front on March the 27th, resistance melted away, and on the 1st of April, an ailing generalissimo, suffering from the flu, announced that the long civil war was finally over." End quote. On the 9th of February, shortly before the end of the war, the Law of Political Responsibilities was issued, which defined the repercussions for those who had helped the Republican war effort. Almost no stone was left unturned. Even cases of grave passivity could be punished. All members of revolutionary and leftist political parties were automatically indicted, as well as anyone who had joined the tribunals which handed out death sentences in the Republican zone. Being a Freemason would also get you in hot water. Regional courts were established all over the country, ready to go into action at the war's end. Some of the possible penalties included 6 months to 15 years in jail, internal exile, banishment to one of the African territories, or severe restrictions on personal and professional activities. Franco had always been a firm disciplinarian and followed the rules to a T, and his harshness after the war's end is hardly surprising. He didn't see it as some great revenge, but simply as him doing his duty in a necessary task, no matter how bloody. By the end of 1939, the prison population of Franco's Spain was 270,000. Going through them all was hardly going to be an easy, never mind a quick task. Franco was no Stalin or even a Hitler, however, and in fitting with his character, the repression was well organised. Even his biggest critics thought so. One Spanish historian who fits this description said, quote, "The repression was constant, methodic, and regular. Its character was not arbitrary, though it often seemed to be. The repression was fearful, but also selective and rational," end quote. As for the death sentences, there was to be none carried out for purely political crimes, but only for political crimes involving major violence. These executions continued to be carried out until 1945 at an ever-decreasing rate, and when all was said and done, 28,000 were carried out, whilst 51,000 had initially been issued. Repression in general decreased rapidly over time. Almost as soon as it had begun, in fact, a large proportion were released. On the third anniversary of Franco's reign, on the 1st of October 1939, he pardoned all former members of the Republican Armed Forces who were serving sentences of less than 6 years. In January 1940, a special military judicial commission was created to review every single sentence, and they were given the power to either confirm or reduce sentences, but importantly, not to decrease them. In June 1940, provisional liberty was granted to political prisoners serving less than 6 years. In April of the following year, 40,000 more were released when provisional liberty was granted to those serving less than 12 years to celebrate the second anniversary of the end of the war. In October, this was extended to those serving 14-year terms. This process continued year after year, with ever greater forgiveness being displayed. By the end of 1945, only 43,812 Spaniards were in the country's prisons, of whom about 17,000 were political prisoners. Conditions in the prisons themselves are pretty good given the circumstances too. Fewer leftist prisoners, proportionally speaking, died of hunger or disease than did after the Finnish Civil War under their democratic parliamentary government. This isn't to say the conditions weren't harsh. They were, but they were harsh but fair, exactly the way Franco wanted. The first months of Franco's peacetime Spain were spent moving the government ministries to Madrid from all across the country, as well as expanding their administration to the new territory incorporated at the end of the war. Franco himself moved into his new residence in Madrid. He felt he should move into the royal palace itself, but Serrano Suna, by now his chief advisor, convinced him that this would alienate his monarchist supporters. Instead, he moved into El Pardo, just northwest of the city, a palace built by the Habsburgs. Franco would live here for the rest of his life, and he was kindly donated a summer residence by the people of La Coruña, not far from his birthplace. Franco kept up his austere lifestyle, but he had nothing on neighbouring Salazar in Portugal, who essentially lived as a civilian. Franco's family quickly became wealthy off the back of his reign, even though embezzlement or kickbacks were never part of Franco's practice. El Cordio spent much of 1939 visiting various parts of the country, not by plane, however, but by car. The fates of Mola and San Giorgio had put him off air travel and his wife urged him against it. He was no Hitler when it came to security. Franco always had a huge escort. His speeches were heavily guarded and often brief. The people, however, did genuinely love him, and whenever he was in town, everyone always wanted to catch a glimpse of him, despite him being nowhere near as charismatic as the other dictators of Europe. A Franco cult did develop regardless though. His face and name adorned the walls of public buildings all across the country. His portrait stood next to that of Jose Antonio in workplaces, and crowds always shouted, "Franco, Franco, Franco." As 1939 drew to a close, Franco wrote up a list of his priorities and distributed it to his ministers. It went as follows: the establishment of public order, improving medical care, reducing Spain's very high infant mortality, improving Spanish housing as 30% of Spanish dwellings were deemed unhealthy, full employment, and the transformation of secondary school and university education. He went on to admit that the army was a big drain on the nation's finances, but said that there was no question of lowering it whilst war raged in Europe. The document ended by acknowledging Spain's very low wages for state employees. Fixing all of these problems, among others, proved harder than Franco imagined, as the Civil War had been incredibly destructive to the nation. Debt was huge. The gold reserves had been shipped off to the Soviets by the Republican government. Industrial production was down 31% from 1935, and agricultural production was down 28%. Half the country's trains had been lost, and 1/3 of Spain's merchant shipping had been sunk. The Republican government themselves had looted their zone bare, and very little was ever recovered. Spain had been looted dry by its own citizens, essentially. Initially, Franco attempted a kind of autarky, and he believed Spain could support itself, but this proved an uphill battle. Franco was extremely reluctant to take any foreign loans, especially while he had his debts to pay to Hitler and Mussolini. This severely hampered the reconstruction process. Hitler demanded payment in full, but Mussolini was extremely benevolent and accommodating. He wrote off a large chunk of it and arranged for the rest to be paid off over a 25-year period, beginning in mid-1942. Franco made the last payment on schedule in 1967. In the short term, without going into a confusing financial ramble, the period following the Civil War can be described as one of intense hardship for the Spanish people. Rationing remained in place for a long time, and a huge black market developed covering pretty much any item imaginable. From 1939 to 1944, there were at least 200,000 deaths from malnutrition and disease, above the pre-war death rate. When people ask why Spain didn't join Hitler and Mussolini in their war, these facts, above all others, must be kept in mind. Franco waved away such suffering as deserved due to the spiritual apostasy of half the nation. In March 1940, he said in a speech, quote, "The suffering undergone by a nation at a given point in its history is no accident. It is spiritual punishment imposed by a god on a distorted life, on an unclean history." End quote. When it came to the war in Europe, Franco was cautious, yet there was always a slight temptation at the back of his mind. He described his foreign policy in 1939 as one of supple prudence. Germany wanted no more than benevolent neutrality from Spain. The Spaniards played nice with everyone, but they were very evidently in the Axis camp, and this was clearly where they wanted to fall into in the long term. Much of the Spanish leadership felt that maybe, just maybe, they would be able to prove the decisive factor in a war between the Axis and her enemies, yet this would be a long way off. Franco told Ciano during a visit in June 1939 that his nation needed at least 5 years of peace to strengthen itself. When war did break out, Franco was a little taken aback by the German cooperation with the Soviets. The Polish government was a Catholic and authoritarian one, much like his own, although the Polish regime was far more liberal. The Poles, however, had brought it upon themselves, he said, due to how badly they had handled the Danzig crisis and how provocative they had been. Whilst the crisis was still ongoing, Franco offered to mediate if necessary. This actually came up on the 30th of August. The French foreign minister suggested that Franco act as mediator between Poland and Germany, yet Mussolini vetoed the proposal because he felt it was his place to act as mediator, not Franco's. When war broke out, Franco urged all the parties involved to reconsider their positions before it was too late. A few days later, he declared his neutrality. Franco wasn't an idiot, however, and he knew that war could come to him, even if he didn't come to it. He immediately set about expanding his army and improving his defences on the southern coast and around Gibraltar. During the early war, Franco let the German submarine fleet resupply in 3 of their ports, which they used for the first time in January 1940. The British intelligence services quickly found out, and Franco cancelled this agreement with the Germans, yet he simply restarted it again during the fall of France, and then for 18 months afterwards, the resupply continued, until they were caught out again when a German logbook was captured by the Royal Navy, and the Brits protested rigorously. In late 1939, when the Soviets attacked Finland, Franco immediately leapt to the chance to support the Finns, and he, like Mussolini, sent them some weapons. Franco well remembered that the Finns had provided more volunteers to his cause than any other nation, proportionally speaking. The Finns viewed Franco's struggle as an extension of their own in 1918. Most importantly of all, the conflict proved to Franco that the British and the French lacked firm principles. They had jumped at the chance to defend Poland from Germany over German Danzig, yet they did next to nothing when Russia attacked Finland, completely and utterly unprovoked. When World War II began, Mussolini was greatly embarrassed by the reality that he simply did not have the capabilities to join the war on his allies' side. He then deemed himself a non-belligerent, which wasn't even a category in international law at the time. Effectively, he was on Germany's side, but didn't join the fighting yet. When Germany swept into France, Mussolini let the euphoria of the moment get the better of him, and like a vulture, he dived onto the already bloody carcass of France and tried to steal whatever last scraps he could get. Mussolini knew Spain was too weak to do the same, but he urged Franco to adopt Italy's previous role as a so-called non-belligerent, and Franco agreed on the 12th of June, 1940. This would be Spain's official stance until late 1943, when the situation was much different. Delusions of grandeur slowly began to sweep over the leading figures in Spain. Serrano Suñer, Franco's top advisor and soon-to-be foreign minister, would be the most obvious example, alongside essentially all the main phalangists. Spain thus began a crisis that would last for the next few years, with phalangists on the one side urging intervention, and the more monarchist and conservative figures on the other urging logic. The former idea was highly emotional and risky. They just wanted to dive in and hope for the best, the goal being an empire in Northwest and West Africa. Some phalangists even suggested and outright told the Germans that they wished to invade and absorb Portugal. The latter idea was pure logic. Spain simply was not ready for war in terms of material and even in terms of tactics. The Spanish army was essentially a fossil in comparison to the far more advanced armies of Britain, Germany and the Soviet Union. In these men's eyes, joining such a large-scale war, no matter how likely German victory looked at the time, would be a disaster. The Portuguese regime, led by the ever level-headed Salazar in the west, was genuinely fully neutral and did their best to promote the same cause in Spain too. 2 days after announcing his non-belligerency, Franco sent some of his Moroccan units into the international zone of Tangier in Morocco. This ended up being the only measure of territorial expansion Franco ever took. At the time, the measure was announced as necessary, as Spain was the only nation that governed the zone who was not at war, although privately this was envisioned as the first of many Spanish conquests. The Spanish then began to build up their forces in Morocco in case circumstances would allow them to expand at the expense of the now nearly defeated France. The reality, however, was that these Spanish units, the best they had to offer, were not even a match for the small French forces in the area. The German consul in Tetuan bluntly reported home, quote, "One cannot describe the Spanish military organization here in bad enough terms," end quote. Despite this reality, the phalangists back home whipped up an absolute propaganda storm, promoting war against Spain's eternal enemies, England and France. They dreamt of a glorious revenge after the last few centuries of utter humiliation. Franco himself drifted further and further into this delusion. The British, meanwhile, were under no illusions about how messy a Spanish entry into the war would be. The Spanish could be easily defeated, yet the problem would be the Spanish terrain. Once the Germans swept in to support their ally, things would be nightmarish and take years, much as in the Peninsular War over a century earlier. To avoid this outcome, the Brits had deployed Samuel Hoare as the new foreign minister in May 1940, who worked wonders, and they also began the biggest bribery operation in foreign relations history. $13 million, an absolutely obscene sum for the time, went to Spanish generals through third parties, and in return these generals would promote a policy of peace, which they genuinely believed was in the interests of Spain, as they were told this by the third parties. The soon-to-be-replaced foreign minister at the time was even receiving payments too. The British scheme went deep into the Spanish regime, and was probably highly effective, although there's no way to actually measure that, of course. In June, Franco wrote a personal letter to Hitler regarding the French situation, in which he called the imminent German victory, quote, "the greatest battle in history," end quote. He also said that he felt it was one that, quote, "my people feels is its own," end quote. Most importantly, it read, quote, "I need not assure you how great is our desire not to remain apart from your concerns, and how great is my satisfaction to lend you in every moment the assistance that you might find useful," end quote. Franco continued on in this vein, and over the next few months he spoke publicly of Spain building an empire and the new European order. Germany, however, was pursuing a policy which would get in the way of this. The terms against France had been relatively mild in order to make Britain make peace. As a result, the French Empire in North Africa remained intact, and Spain was boxed in. Hitler knew full well that Spain being in the war would probably bring more problems than solutions, and so for now he felt no pressure to change course. Hitler's decision regarding France, however, was quickly proven wrong, as Churchill solidified his rule and crushed any attempt at making peace from the British side. In August, Franco was writing to Mussolini about Spanish claims, asking the Duce to pressure Hitler to accept them. Quote, "From the beginning of the present war, it has been our intention to make every effort to intervene to the extent of our possibilities when a favourable moment arises," end quote. And he asked Mussolini to help Spain, quote, "occupy its place in the struggle against our common enemies," end quote. Technically, Spain was neutral, but this was stretching the definition to the absolute limit. On the 16th of September, Serrano Suñer, known as the most hated man in Spain for his belligerently pro-Nazi policies, led a delegation to Berlin to discuss terms which might lead to Spain joining the war. In an interview with the Volkische Beobachter, Suñer made a claim which was very popular in Spain at the time. Quote, "We hold the thesis that our war was the first phase of the present war. We fought, at the same time, against the Red Revolution and against what we might call the old regime of Europe. The Republic and the Popular Front were the last arms of the enslavement of Spain to the capitalism of the great democracies," end quote. The talks went nowhere, and most Germans were completely ignorant of Spain, her history, and her affairs. Ribbentrop deeply offended the Spaniards by suggesting that they cede one of the Canary Islands to Germany for the Battle of the Atlantic. Ribbentrop most likely thought that the islands were colonial possessions like Ifni or Equatorial Guinea, but regardless, he torpedoed the talks. Payne writes of what the Spanish wanted in return for entering the war, and indeed, their terms were heavy, although negotiable. Quote, "What Franco asked was the cession to Spain of all French Morocco, northwestern Algeria, and a large swath of territory from French West Africa, below the Sahara. In addition, he insisted on very extensive German military supplies and support, as well as large shipments of goods of various kinds to sustain the faltering Spanish economy." End quote. On the 23rd of October, Franco and Hitler met for the first and only time in their lives on the French border. Things immediately got off to a bad start, as Franco ended up being late due to the disastrous condition of the Spanish rail system after the war. Things only got worse. Hitler believed the two could come to a quick general agreement, whereas Franco came to have a serious, long discussion to get everything out of the way at once. He summed up in his notes that morning, quote, "Spain cannot enter just for fun," end quote. The first part of the meeting lasted 3 hours. Franco began by thanking Hitler for all he had done for Spain during the Civil War, and then they got down to business. Hitler explained that a broad front had to be taken up against Britain, which included Vichy France. Any territorial concessions in Africa for Spain would have to wait until after the war, he said. Hitler was in fact promising Spain, France, and Italy very similar things in North Africa, and his visit to Franco was actually part of a larger tour in which he met the heads of state of all three nations. Hitler made sure not to promise anything specific to Franco from France, due to what he deemed the Latin inability to keep secrets. In the end, Franco ended up talking more than the ever-talkative Hitler. He droned on and on about his time in Morocco, general Moroccan history as it relates to Spain, and other personal experiences. Hitler clearly wasn't a fan, as a few days later he said to Mussolini that he would prefer to have 3 or 4 teeth pulled out, rather than go through another meeting with Franco again. He also complained to the Duce of Franco's unrealistic goals, and said that he, quote, "lacks the stature of a leader or organizer," end quote. Indeed, Hitler didn't buy any of what Franco was selling. He demanded a very heavy price to join the war in terms of territory, weaponry, and even supplies like grain to keep Spain afloat. The two men left thinking they would still get their own way, but ultimately, nothing concrete came from the meeting. Thus, the greatest opportunity for Spain to join the war came and went. On the 4th of November, a document was signed, mostly thanks to Foreign Minister Suna, in which Spain promised to join the war at some unspecified future date. The Germans felt they had finally got their way, but in reality the agreement may as well have been a blank piece of paper, as no exact date had been set, and everything was to remain secret. Soon after Franco's meeting with Hitler, the Italians invaded Greece, and the Phalangists began to clamour for their own parallel war, too. Suna had been essentially threatening the Portuguese for a while now, but the level-headed Salazar simply sidestepped the overbearing foreign minister and negotiated with Franco by his older brother, Nicolas Franco, ambassador to Portugal. A friendship treaty had been signed in 1939, and in 1940 this was expanded upon, yet the Greece fiasco brought tensions up again to the point where war plans were even drawn up. Thankfully for Portugal and level-headed Spaniards, however, this crisis came as soon as it went, as the Italians were utterly embarrassed in their little adventure. Another meeting took place between Suna and Hitler at the Berghof in late 1940, as the Führer was growing impatient, but even Suna had to admit that Spain needed more assurances by now. Back home, there were near-famine conditions, and it wasn't uncommon to see a passerby collapse from hunger in the street. Things were once again left at an impasse. Franco was given further pause in December, as his ever-reliable and level-headed chief of naval planning, Captain Blanco, reported that the capture of Gibraltar would not be decisive. The Brits could still strangle Spain economically in the Atlantic, and he suggested that Spain should never join the war under any circumstances, whilst the Suez Canal was still in Allied hands. Even then, he said, the Canary Islands would be left completely open to the Royal Navy, and the Spanish fleet wouldn't stand a chance. Cooler heads were gradually beginning to make themselves known. The most ironic thing about this entire situation was that Britain was currently supplying Franco with the vital resources he needed to keep his nation afloat. Without them, his people would literally starve. Despite all this, he was plotting a war against them. The British weren't idiots, however, and this was precisely why they continued to make themselves so necessary to Spain's survival. Later in the war, the Anglo-Americans would buy tungsten at ridiculous rates, purely to price the Germans out, greatly supporting the Spanish economy. By the 21st of January 1941, the Germans were getting even more annoyed. Ribbentrop ordered a 6-point communique to be read to Franco, which declared that Franco could not have won the Civil War without German help, and that the time would come to act. Quote, "The Führer and the Reich government are deeply disturbed by the equivocal and vacillating attitude of Spain," end quote. The conclusion was even more ominous. It concluded that if Spain did not enter the war, then the right government could not but, quote, foresee the end of nationalist Spain, end quote. Franco replied that these statements were extremely grave and contained untruths. Regardless, he claimed that he would join the war when the current economic weaknesses were overcome, and he did truly believe this. On the 24th, Ribbentrop replied demanding an exact date, and promised 100,000 tons of grain as soon as he got one. The back and forth continued, and by the 28th, Ribbentrop furiously contacted his ambassador and demanded to know what on earth was going on and why he was allowing Franco to turn the tables on Germany, blaming them for the situation. Hitler, meanwhile, slowly began to let things go, and any operations against Gibraltar were postponed indefinitely. He had bigger issues to plan in the east. Franco and Mussolini met for the first and only time on the 12th of February 1941 in the Italian Riviera. 6 weeks earlier, Hitler had handed over the task of convincing Franco to the Duce. Franco proceeded slowly by land in an elaborate motorcade as he refused to travel by air. Once he arrived, Mussolini rolled out the usual arguments, but the discouragement that was all over the faces of the Italian leadership was impossible to hide. Mussolini and his men were trying to convince the Spaniards to join a war they themselves already regretted joining. Suffice to say, the meeting didn't accomplish anything. After Hitler got the reports, he gave up winning over Franco for good. There would be no more direct efforts to pressure Spain into the war. Throughout the entire process, neither side had lied to each other. Spain was woefully under-equipped to join a war of this scale, and they made that clear to Hitler. Meanwhile, Hitler didn't promise any French territory to Franco that wasn't his to give away. The two sides weren't able to agree on the massive amount of supplies Spain would need, and in the end, it was probably better for everyone. The Spaniards genuinely did want to join the war, and they completely believed in the Axis cause, yet their worsening domestic situation prevented them from being able to just dive in. Serrano's undersecretary summed it up perfectly. Quote, "We didn't get into the war, not so much because Franco resisted German pressure, as because Hitler didn't want it that badly." End quote. In April, when Hitler secured his lightning victory in Yugoslavia and Greece, the Spaniards were once again overwhelmed with the feeling that Hitler was unstoppable, and the Great Temptation reared its head seriously for the last time. Spanish merchant ship captains were given instructions on what to do if they suddenly learned that they were at war, and the papal nuncio feared that Franco was imminently about to take the plunge. In the end, though, the moment passed quickly, and everyone kept their heads. In the background, there was a scheme growing against Franco. Many monarchists were growing increasingly impatient as no measures had been made towards a restoration yet, and Don Juan, son of the now deceased Alfonso VIII, was scheming with the Germans about overthrowing Franco. The plan was to install Juan with German and Falangist support, and in return, Spain would enter the war on the Axis side. Hitler, however, had no such interest in this ridiculous scheme, and soon enough, the monarchists began to look the other way towards the Allies when the war took a clear turn in 1942. It was during this time of crisis that Captain Luis Carrero Blanco gained more and more influence, eventually replacing Suna as Franco's right-hand man. Blanco was everything that Franco could possibly want. He was loyal, a devout Catholic, never sought the limelight, and was extremely closely aligned to Franco ideologically. Carrero understood Franco better than anyone else, and he would slowly become one of the most important figures in Spain. Most importantly of all, he was level-headed. He was cautiously pro-German, yet completely understood the international situation, and made sure not to throw Spain into a situation from which he could not recover. In June, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was received with overwhelming joy, a true modern-day crusade, much in the same way as the Spaniards viewed their own civil war. The Franco government official communication read, quote, "God has opened the eyes of statesmen in time, and for the past 48 hours, struggle has been waged against the beast of the apocalypse in the most colossal conflict known to history, to destroy the most savage oppression of all time." End quote. The idea of sending a volunteer legion began to crop up almost immediately. There were some very valid criticisms about this action, as the war was now very complicated, and many didn't want to infuriate the Allies. Yet Franco saw this move as entirely logical, and a way of paying back Germany for their help in the Civil War. The Blue Division was born. There was immediately so many volunteers across Spain that many who met the requirements simply couldn't be accepted. The most enthusiastic were of course the Falangists, and many monarchists saw this as a good way to solve their own domestic troubles. Many of the fanatically pro-Germans who were constantly agitating to join the war would now pack themselves off east, solving the domestic crisis while at the same time fighting communism. 18,000 men were soon organised into a huge unit who bore the Falangist blue shirt from which the division was to gain its name. Eventually, it would become one of, if not the most celebrated unit of World War II, or at least one of the most well-researched and well-remembered by far. After the US joined the war, the attitude in Spain initially remained much the same, and it wasn't believed that the United States would make much of a difference in Europe itself. Franco, however, did begin to slowly drift away and began to exercise more caution for Spain's sake. He wasn't present at the first big celebration when some of the Blue Division veterans returned home, and he tried to replace their extremely pro-German commander with his own pick, yet Hitler wouldn't let the current commander go. In April 1942, Roosevelt appointed a new ambassador to Spain who would be better able to deal with Franco. Carlton Hayes, the man chosen for the job, was a Catholic convert himself and ended up getting on with, and indeed dealing well with, Franco. He wrote of his first meeting with the Caudillo, quote, "The general, I soon perceived, differed notably from the caricatures of him currently in the leftist press in the United States. Physically he was not so short, nor so stout, and he did not strut. Mentally, he impressed me as being not at all a stupid or me too sort of person, but distinctly alert and possessing a good deal of both determination and caution, and a rather lively and spontaneous sense of humour. He laughed easily and naturally, which, I imagine, a Hitler couldn't do and a Mussolini wouldn't do, except in private." End quote. For the rest of the war, Hayes was able to push the American hard line while simultaneously retaining Franco's respect. No easy task. In mid-1942, Franco's father, a bitter and angry man, was nearing his end. He completely rejected his son's attempt at reconciliation, which would have meant abandoning his second wife, and everywhere he went he complained bitterly about Franco, spoke up for the Jews and the Freemasons, and referred to his son as un inepto. He had lost many of his fellow left-wingers in the Civil War, and he detested Franco's regime's focus on Catholicism. Franco had done all he could for his father from the shadows, such as providing him with a driver and an official car to get around in, yet he still seemed to detest his own son. On the 23rd of February, Nicholas Franco's new wife, who Franco refused to have anything to do with, sent word to Francisco that his father was on his deathbed. Payne writes of the event, which reveals a lot about Franco's pious character. Quote, "Franco's main concern seems to have been that his father reconcile with the church and not die in concubinage. He refused to visit his father, but called his sister, Pilar, instead, dispatching her, together with a priest, to the apartment. The elder Franco refused to confess or reconcile, however, and died about dawn the following morning. Pilar Franco followed her brother's instructions to have their father's corpse dressed in the uniform of a vice admiral, his final naval rank, after which last rites were performed at the chapel in El Pardo, with only the Francos attending. The remains of Don Nicolas were then buried beside those of his former wife in the Franco family section at Al Almudena Cemetery. A company of naval infantry was present to honour him at his interment, but none of the family attended. Agostina survived her companion by many years, completely ostracised by the Francos. Henceforth, references by the Caudillo to his father would be extremely rare, though always expressed in terms of respect. He probably experienced some relief at his father's passing." End quote. On the 16th of August, a major political crisis arose as some Falangist terrorists threw hand grenades at a Carlist memorial mass, causing several injuries and later 2 deaths. The anti-Falangist elements of the regime seized on this insane act and protested vigorously to Franco. Initially, Franco refused to believe the true version of events, yet eventually he was won over and allowed justice to be served. The Falangist Blue Division veteran who threw one of the hand grenades was condemned to death and executed. The exact motives for the attack will perhaps never be known, but most importantly, the event triggered a reshuffling, which led to Serrano being given the boot. General Francisco Gomez Jordana Souza was brought in as his replacement, and he ended up being essentially the opposite of the previous foreign minister. Serrano tried to drag Spain towards war, whilst Jordana would drag Spain away from it. He would write in his diary, quote, "God help Spain and protect her from getting into this conflict, which would be a catastrophe for us." End quote. As the year drew near its close, there was fear what the impending Allied invasion might bring for Spain, especially if it was in northwest Africa. On the 8th of November, the Allies indeed chose French Morocco as their landing zone, and hours before they did so, both Roosevelt and Churchill were sent personal letters directly to Franco, promising him that the Allied powers had zero interest in interfering with Spanish affairs, even remotely. There was a normal partial mobilization of the Spanish armed forces, but that was about it. The invasion came and went, and Spain remained unharmed. On the 3rd of December, Franco admitted to Ribbentrop for the first time that he had become convinced that Spain's entry into the war would be undesirable for both military and economic reasons. Soon afterwards, Hitler finally released Munoz Grandes as leader of the Blue Division, and upon his return, Franco had him promoted to a position in which he could no longer cause trouble with his extremely pro-German ideas. The process of drifting away from the Axis camp increased slowly over time. The next major step was in July 1943, when Mussolini was overthrown by the Grand Council of Fascism, the king, and the military. Panic set in all across Spain, although Franco himself did, admittedly, retain his customary calmness. In August, Spanish institutions began a slow process of defalangization. On the 24th, the FET's University Syndicate forbade all comparisons between Spain and the totalitarian regimes fighting in the war. Meanwhile, the media was ordered to begin reporting more neutrally on events. The new Italian government immediately reached out to Franco and asked him to help mediate a separate peace for them. The Caudillo simply ignored them, not wishing to get involved and potentially risk a German invasion. On the flip side, an official representative wasn't sent to Mussolini's puppet government in the north, either. These measures to keep Spain safe weren't enough for some, and many monarchists felt that only a restoration could keep Spain afloat. On the 15th of September, General Varela, de facto leader of the senior generals, barged into his office and handed over a document to Franco, signed by 8 lieutenant generals, and suggested that perhaps now was the time to restore the monarchy. For the first and only time during Franco's reign, his senior commanders were politely asking him to resign. Franco had no such intention of stepping down, and he met with the dissident generals and explained the situation to them. None were willing to challenge him personally, and none were punished directly. The slow process of implementing actual neutrality continued, and the FET was no longer to be referred to as a party, but as the National Movement. The doctrine of the movement was moderated more towards a Catholic corporatism, rather than any kind of fascism. The Blue Division, too, was withdrawn in October, and so was the policy of non-belligerence. Despite all this, Franco had not given up on Germany completely. He couldn't conceive of a situation where they would be completely defeated, and he argued that if the special friendship between the two nations were maintained, then if Germany won the war, or even survived as a great power, then Madrid would enjoy great support from Berlin in the future. Allied pressure was increasing, however, and Franco was forced to tone down this friendship even more. The primary issue now was Portuguese and Spanish tungsten, which the Germans were buying in massive quantities. In November 43, the Americans demanded a total embargo, but Franco rejected this, as was his right. This was a mistake, however, and the Americans, who took a far harder line than the Brits, put their foot down. On the 29th of January 1944, the US suspended all shipments of petroleum amongst other items to Spain, which could well cripple their economy. The greatest economic emergency of the war thus ensued. Franco explained to the German ambassador that he would do all he could to help Germany, but also that he could not allow his country to be strangled economically. An agreement with Washington and London was worked out on the 2nd of May. Franco agreed to cease almost all tungsten shipments to Germany. The Blue Legion, the small successor to the Blue Division, was to be retired. The German consulate was closed in Tangier, and all German spies and saboteurs were to be expelled from Spanish territory. This last measure was never fully carried out, however. After this agreement, Spain was for the first time in the war not only neutral, but actually tilted towards the Allies. The response in Germany was one of anger, but Hitler himself intervened and suggested that Franco was doing the best he could in his situation, and said that the best thing overall was to maintain the special relationship between the two nations, regardless of the circumstances. The Treaty of Friendship that had been signed in 1939 was up for renewal that month, and it went ahead with no complaints. In June, Franco's belief that Germany would not lose was absolutely shattered as the Allies successfully landed in Normandy. He and his advisors saw no possible route to survival for Germany anymore, never mind a victory. In August, Foreign Minister Jordana suddenly died after a hunting accident, but he had served his task well. Thanks in large part to him, Spain had avoided becoming any more entangled with an unwinnable war than it already had been. On the 18th of October, Franco wrote a letter to Winston Churchill, stating that a closer relationship between their two nations was needed for the post-war world if Europe was to be saved from the Soviet Union. Franco saw the future much more clearly than Churchill did. Churchill, however, did not reply for 3 months, and even then in guarded terms. He couldn't risk any kind of anti-communist letter being leaked at such a vital moment if he wanted Stalin's continued support. Churchill wasn't an enemy of Franco, however, and he said that he would rather live in Franco's Spain than Stalin's Russia, and stated that Franco had, quote, done us much more good than harm during the war, end quote. Not everyone was so friendly in Britain, however. The British ambassador even said to the Spanish at the time that there was no possibility of good relations as long as Spain remained a dictatorship. Lequerica, the new foreign minister, innocently replied that this surely couldn't be the case, as Britain was so friendly with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, American opinion and policy towards Spain was absolutely poisonous and far tougher. In November, Franco made another PR move in an interview with the United Press. He said that his regime would maintain complete neutrality during the war, and that his movement had nothing to do with fascism because, quote, Spain could never associate with other governments for whom Catholicism was not a fundamental principle, end quote. In April 1945, Franco broke relations with the Japanese due to atrocities against Spanish civilians in the Philippines. As the war in Europe drew to a close, a message was sent around to quiet complaints from the more fanatical elements of the party. Inside there was posed a rhetorical question, quote, what do they want? For Spain to commit suicide because Germany is losing the war? End quote. The new propaganda angle was that, quote, celebrating peace is to celebrate the triumph of the Phalange and of the Caudillo, end quote. Despite all this, the Spanish press lamented the death of Hitler 2 weeks later, whom held an extremely close place in the hearts of most Spaniards. After all, he had helped considerably in saving them from far-left terror. The next few months didn't bode well for Spain. The Truman administration was even more hostile than the Roosevelt one had been. Clement Attlee replaced Churchill in the UK, and the Soviets relentlessly called for Franco to be overthrown. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies suggested that relations be broken with Franco in favour of, quote, democratic forces, end quote. Nations then did break off relations, including Mexico and Panama. The UK and France were now led by deeply left-wing governments who wanted Franco dead and buried. It seemed as if Spain no longer had a friend in the world, except the ever-reliable Salazar next door. The war may have ended for Europe, but the struggle was only just getting started for Spain. The post-war treatment of Franco's Spain was absolutely hysterical. Even the early Soviet Union hadn't received anywhere near as much ostracism. One French intelligence report suggested that 100,000 Nazis were hiding in Spain, and the Soviet spokesman at the United Nations boldly claimed that 200,000 Nazis had escaped to Spain and that they were developing atomic bombs in a town 70 kilometers outside Madrid. They were then planning to invade France in 1946, supposedly. The Polish War Ministry in 1946 spoke in the same vein when they said that Franco was developing an advanced war industry supervised by German scientists. The reality was so different that it was almost laughable. Payne writes, quote, at that time, most Spanish soldiers had no boots and were wearing sandals instead, while the feeble Spanish army almost completely lacked mobility and was equipped primarily with pre-World War II arms, end quote. As for the accusation of escaped Nazis, this was overblown in the extreme. Over 1,000 Nazis, indeed, were in Spain, but they were mostly low-level collaborators. Many Germans had been sent back, and Pierre Laval, the French collaborator, had been turned back only to be executed in France. Léon de Grelle, not even a German, was perhaps the biggest name in Spain, alongside Otto Skorzeny. The Allies, meanwhile, pumped Spanish anarchists, socialists, and communists across the French border to cause havoc in Spain. This had little effect, however, and all it did was boomerang and give the regime more support. Franco was happy to cooperate with the Allies, however, and when asked to abandon Tangier shortly after the war, he happily did so. There were internal problems to deal with too. In February 1945, Don Juan, the only serious contender for the Spanish throne, sent a letter to General Alfredo Kinderlan, quote, this dictator and his regime, whether we seek it or not, is inexorably condemned to be overthrown amid grave convulsions, which only benefit the forces of disorder. Therefore, it is important to take a position before world opinion by publishing a document or a manifesto in which, while specifying the fundamental principles of the monarchy, Franco is urged to hand over power to those who gave it to him, so that the king can receive it from the army unanimously, end quote. On the 19th of March, 1945, Don Juan, the very same man who had been begging the Germans to scheme with him the whole war so that he could gain the throne and join the war, published a political manifesto from Switzerland. It said that Franco's regime was, quote, inspired from the beginning by the systems of the Axis powers, end quote. He then went on to urge Franco to abdicate. This was treason of the highest order, exactly at the time when the world was getting its claws out for Franco and his regime. Francisco, however, had no interest whatsoever in stepping aside, and Don Juan was left to his irrelevance. Franco's attitude by now was summed up in a comment to Kinderlan, quote, I will not be as foolish as Primo de Rivera. I will not resign. From here, only to the cemetery, end quote. The response was comical anyway. The pretender called on all monarchists to abandon their posts in the diplomatic service, but only one did so, and even he was convinced by Franco to stay on for another 6 months. The monarchists were horribly disorganised. The number 2 leader of the monarchist opposition under the Republic, now governor of the Bank of Spain, even denounced Don Juan. Most monarchists didn't feel the time was right yet, and felt Franco still had more time left to steady the ship before any major long-term solution. Despite this treachery, Franco tried to seek rapprochement with Don Juan behind the scenes. Franco and his top advisor, Blanco, felt that Don Juan was completely incapable of being king himself. However, they felt that relations with the royal family should be kept up, and that Juan Carlos, Juan's 7-year-old son, should be trained and educated as a future heir instead. Don Juan, for now, ignored these offers and instead formed his own provisional government. There was also another Republican exile government created in Mexico City. Both had no impact. Franco was simply too well loved at home. As for the regime itself, the Catholic elements of it continued to be emphasised, and better relations were sought with the Vatican, as they always had been, although now this would have the added benefit of helping the regime survive. There were many other suggestions, too. Sooner came out of the wilderness to suggest forming a new National Front government, to which Franco simply wrote "ha ha ha" next to the suggestion on the letter. Blanco, meanwhile, was one of the few who recommended that Franco make as few changes as possible. He said that the regime had been built on order, unity, and standing firm, and indeed, that was the way it would continue to be. Blanco genuinely had Franco's best interests at heart, unlike some, and Franco was more than willing to take his advice. Regardless, a major concession was made in October 45, when Franco declared amnesty for all prisoners still serving sentences for civil war crimes. For the moment, a lot of these measures didn't do much good with foreign opinion. The Third Reich archives clearly showed the extensive collaboration between the two nations, and in November, the American ambassador simply abandoned Madrid and left the embassy in the hands of the chargé d'affaires. Other nations cut ties to various degrees with Spain too. Franco, however, was happy to wait. He knew full well what the future brought, and this was proved correct when in 1946, Churchill made his famous Iron Curtain speech in Missouri. The Spanish regime felt completely vindicated. They had been right, all along. For now though, things would get worse, not better. On the 12th of December, the UN General Assembly voted 34-6 in favour of withdrawing diplomatic recognition from Franco's Spain. After this, the Brits, the last major country left in Spain, withdrew their ambassador. It is important to note that no Western state completely broke relations with Spain. It was more of a failed bluff, if anything. The nations to oppose this motion were Portugal, Argentina, Switzerland, Ireland, and the Vatican. They all kept their ambassadors. The Arab countries and South America abstained too. Just before the vote, there had been a massive gathering, perhaps the biggest in Spanish history, to show support for Franco in Madrid. The only gathering to surpass it would be the visit of Pope John Paul II 36 years later. During the period of ostracism, Franco had sought to develop closer ties with South America. He had always done this, but now it was especially important. The most responsive nation to his doctrine of Hispanidad was Juan Perón's Argentina. Perón viewed Franco's Spain as a sort of brother regime, as both sought independence from the globalist framework of the time. He defied the United Nations and named an ambassador to Franco. Yet this was just the start. A huge deal was signed in which Argentina would supply Spain with their much-needed grain. In 1948, Argentina provided 25% of all goods brought into Spain, and for 2 years they guaranteed vital foodstuffs. In 1947, the Argentinian First Lady, Evita Perón, came to visit, and a huge spectacle was made of it. The Spanish people were genuinely appreciative of all her husband had done for Spain, and her reception reflected as much. Eventually, the two nations' relationship deteriorated, but when Perón needed to seek asylum after being deposed, Franco was happy to accommodate after all Perón had done for his nation. Franco would admonish Perón for his conflict with the church. Quote, "Juan Domingo, keep calm and try to reach an agreement. Remember that the church is eternal, while our regimes are transitory." End quote. Franco's own regime was building better and better relations with the church too. Quote, "This close relationship between the Spanish government and the church offered many advantages to the church. It became a dominant voice in primary education and won manifold financial subsidies and tax exemptions. On its behalf, the government rebuilt hundreds of destroyed or heavily damaged church buildings and constructed many new ones, renovated and expanded seminaries, enforced church norms in many aspects of life, and established a special judicial procedure and protection for clergy accused of violating civil law." End quote. The people themselves continued with their gigantic religious revival, which had begun during the Civil War too. On the 27th of March, 1947, Franco took advantage of his huge wave of support to declare his next move and preempt the monarchists. The first article of the new law of succession read, quote, "Spain, as a political unit, is a Catholic social and representative state, which, in keeping with her tradition, declares herself constituted into a kingdom." End quote. Essentially, Spain was now a monarchy without a monarch, much like Hungary had been. Further into the document, it stated that Franco would rule until his death or incapacity. Only then would a monarch step in, and that would be the long-term solution. No exact monarch was announced, and the law reserved Franco the right to cancel the right of succession to any member of the royal family in the event of, quote, "notorious departure from the fundamental principles of the state." End quote. A regency council was then set up, which contained the president of the Cortes, the most senior general of the armed forces, and the highest-ranking church prelate who had served for the longest period. If Franco were to die before naming a successor, then the council would convene and elect one. Less than 2 weeks later, Don Juan, now living in Portugal, proclaimed that the new legislation was, quote, "completely opposed to the laws that historically have regulated the succession to the crown." End quote. Franco turned the matter over to the nation, and an election was held. Of 17,178,812 qualified adult voters, 15,219,565 turned out. Of these, 14,145,163 voted yes to Franco's legislation, and only 722,656 voted no, whilst 356,592 votes were null or mutilated. Don Juan had been completely discredited, and Franco achieved a gigantic propaganda victory. Franco used his new powers to create new noble titles. The Civil War veterans were especially rewarded. The first recipients of dukedoms were the heirs of Primo de Rivera, Mola, and Calvo Sotelo. Over the years, he created 36 new titles. 17 went to the military, whilst only 3 went to the Phalange. Whilst all this was going on, the French were still allowing terrorists to cross the border and cause havoc. The biggest terrorist incident during the post-war left-wing insurgency was in February 1949, when a bomb blew up in the train station of Mora la Nueva, killing 33 and wounding hundreds more. This was but one of many, and between 1943 and 1950, there was a total of 8,054 insurgent actions on Spanish territory. 2,036 people had died, and 3,211 had been kidnapped. The Civil Guard had lost 243 men and suffered 341 wounded. 17,861 insurgents or accomplices had been arrested. All any of these events did was unite the country more and more behind Franco, and further blacken the image of the left, if that were even possible by this point. Year by year, however, the incidents slowed down under firm repression. This period coincided with a period of demilitarization once Franco realized that a French invasion was increasingly unlikely. Year by year, the gigantic military expenditure dropped. Between 1945 and 47, the military budget had been reduced by 20% alone. In August 48, Franco and Don Juan finally met face to face. Don Juan's position had continuously weakened, and by now he was advised to simply make his peace with Franco. The monarchy would either be restored under Franco or not at all, Kinderlan told him. The two talked alone for 3 hours on Franco's yacht on the 25th, and reached an agreement that Juan Carlos, Don Juan's 10-year-old son, would be educated in Spain. On the 8th of November, Juan Carlos arrived in Madrid by train and looked out across the bare countryside. He then exclaimed, quote, "Is all of Spain like this?" End quote. He then took up residence north of Madrid, where a special school had been set up just for him and 7 other children from aristocratic families. Later that month, the boy met Franco and supposedly the courtier was impressed. Franco's daughter recalled, quote, "He was a very lively and responsible lad. My father always looked on him favourably, in fact, was enchanted with him. If you're born and grow up in exile, that becomes very difficult. You don't even have any friends in the country over which you will reign, so Papa was really concerned that he be educated in Spain and become acquainted with the Spanish character, rather than through people who come to interview you or some such thing." End quote. In the late 1940s, another problem emerged, that being the state of Israel. At every single turn, Franco was opposed by Israel and the United Nations, and he found this particularly treacherous as his nation had taken in and helped relocate so many Jews during the Second World War when their lives were in peril. The papacy was meanwhile wanting to internationalize the holy city of Jerusalem, and the nation of Israel greatly opposed this. The Spanish had, since the 16th century, held patronage of certain sites in the city, and so Franco supported the benevolent policy of the papacy, tooth and nail. Israel never let him forget it. Over and over again they voted to oppose lifting sanctions against Spain in the UN. Franco was nothing but friendly to Israel and tried to initiate relations on many occasions. All of this came to naught, and relations between the two nations were never established throughout his reign. Israel, like a lot of Western nations, were projecting their gripes with Hitler onto Franco, since he was seen as the last man standing out of the Axis-aligned powers. In 1949, NATO was formed, and Portugal was invited in as a charter member. Salazar, as always, proved a great friend to Spain and championed Spain's entry too, although this was denied. Franco said to an American journalist, quote, "Organising NATO without Spain is like making an omelette without eggs." End quote. Churchill felt much the same, and he said in the House of Commons that ignoring Spain was leaving an open breach in the Western defence. In the same month, a vote was held in the UN regarding continuing or scrapping sanctions against Spain. Israel once again led the charge against Franco. Abba Eban, the Israeli foreign minister, voted no, and said that this was due to Franco aiding Hitler in the persecution against Jews. This was categorically false on every level, and the very opposite was true. Franco was absolutely furious. In 1950, however, things did get better internationally for Franco, despite Israeli interference. In June, the Korean War greatly intensified the Cold War, which made Franco seem ever more vindicated. The Times of London came out in favour of an understanding with Franco, and many American newspapers did the same. The tide was certainly beginning to turn. In fact, Franco felt so secure that year that he and his family took a holiday to visit the Spanish Sahara and the Canaries on the way home. On the 4th of November, the ostracism officially ended as the General Assembly of the United Nations voted 39-10 to lift the sanctions and to resume normal relations with Franco's Spain. The new American ambassador was welcomed with a lavish reception, and in July 1951, 9 American senators came to visit Spain. A few days later, the American Chief of Naval Operations came to visit Franco at his home, despite protests from London and Paris. Here, Franco stated that he didn't wish to join NATO, but wished to sign a bilateral agreement with the United States. The US, formerly so harsh on Franco, now took the opposite stance and led the way in ending Franco's time in the dark. This was purely due to geostrategic reasons. If the gigantic Soviet army was to overrun Western Europe, then the Americans saw the Iberian Peninsula as an area where a last stand could be staged thanks to its harsh terrain. Also, obviously, the hotter the Cold War became, then the less the US cared about regimes such as Franco's when they had far bigger problems. In South America, the US would champion far harsher regimes than Franco soon enough anyway. The end of the ostracism brought other benefits too. Franco had miraculously held the Spanish economy and Spanish society together during these years in the wilderness with heavy restrictions against all odds, but now things would begin to improve. The first year of rapid and sustained overall economic growth was 1951, and between 1950 and 1958, the GDP rose 50%. There were positive signs leading up to these years too. Spaniards were growing taller, infant and maternal mortality had dramatically fallen, and industrial and electrical production had expanded massively. All of this was whilst being under crippling sanctions. Franco had defied the odds. He'd also gained a new confidence now that he was able to partake in international relations too. A huge deal was raised about the continued British occupation of Gibraltar, and Franco saw it as logical that it should return to Spain during the general wave of decolonisation that was now sweeping the world. An annual date each year was set for Gibraltar Day, and there was frequent protests with young phalangists chanting Gibraltar Español. The first offensive failed against British resistance, although Franco did later take up the issue strongly again. During the American elections, Franco openly wanted Eisenhower to win, and when he did so, Franco even offered to send a division of Spanish volunteers to fight in Korea, although soon enough, the war would be over, so this never occurred. That year, 1953, brought 2 important sets of negotiations to an end, namely those with the Vatican and those with the Americans. On the 27th of August, the new Concordat with the papacy was signed, and the Catholic Church essentially obtained everything they asked for. They had a true friend in Franco. Payne describes the Concordat, quote, "The Church would be not only exempt from all taxation, but would receive state financial support for each diocese. The clergy would enjoy judicial immunity, only canonical marriage would be legally binding. The state would administer religious instruction at all levels of education. An insult to someone in a clerical habit would be treated as equivalent to an insult to someone in military uniform, and the chief of state would continue to have to select new bishops only from the church's short list of 3 for each diocese." End quote. A month later, in September, the pact was signed with Washington, which encompassed assistance for mutual defense and economic assistance. American bases were also to be opened on Spanish soil. 3 of these were air bases, and 1 was a submarine base in the south. All of them were to display the Spanish flag and be used jointly by the 2 states. $226 million were to be given to Spain on the condition that they liberalised the heavily regulated economy, which Franco was going to do anyway. By the mid-1950s, the Franco regime had reached the peak of its rehabilitation. There were moments when the Western world looked down on his regime, such as the time when Léon de Grelle, sentenced to death in absentia in Belgium, was photographed celebrating with the finally released Blue Division veterans at the Madrid City Hall in 1954. The following year, however, Spain became a member of the United Nations. His regime was never fully accepted, but relations were normalised. This was almost entirely due to the US, who now led the charge against communism, and was for all intents and purposes, master of Western Europe now. In 1954, Franco had been invited to observe US naval measures in the Mediterranean from the deck of its command ship, the Coral Sea. He dispatched a friendly telegram to President Eisenhower on the occasion, using the phalangist arriba rather than the more traditional viva. Quote, "Arriba los Estados Unidos." In December 1954, Franco once more met with Don Juan regarding his son's education. Franco insisted he complete his further education in Spain, rather than abroad, and he ended up winning over Juan to his idea. By the end of the meeting, in fact, Juan was seemingly won over by Franco, and believed that he would genuinely reinstate the monarchy down the road. He said afterwards to an advisor, quote, "I'd like to shoot all the people who have been speaking badly to me of this man for so many years. Now the only thing is give him our confidence and collaborate, end quote. The future was essentially left in Don Juan's hands. The monarchy would be restored, but whether it be him or his son who took the throne was another matter. That all depended on Don Juan's loyalty to the regime. The regime itself was changing too. Payne writes of 1955, quote, "Though the regime had weathered all storms, its institutional development remained highly uncertain. The defascistization hesitantly begun in August 1943 came to a dead stop 10 years later, as Franco began to reinvigorate the national movement, which he believed was an indispensable support and mobilization device. By 1955, he was dissatisfied with the youth section, for the student syndicate had become very weak, and in fact, in a few more years would disappear altogether. He also thought that the program of partial liberalization being carried out in the universities by the education minister, Joaquin Ruiz Jimenez, had gone too far, permitting, among other things, the organization of a center for young writers, which was becoming openly critical of the regime." End quote. Late that year, US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles came to visit to finalize Spanish entry into the UN. The other topic he came to discuss was Moroccan independence. Franco had said that Morocco was a protectorate for a while now, and accepted that independence was inevitable, yet he saw this as decades in the future, not right around the corner. The very idea of an independent Morocco obviously mortified him, given how much blood he had seen spilled earlier in his life to keep it in Spanish hands. The Moroccan Sultan came to Madrid in April 1956, and Franco had to face facts. Moroccan independence was signed on the 7th, and it was announced as an act of generosity on Franco's part, which had been a long time coming, which wasn't exactly true. It was as if Franco had signed a piece of himself away. He had once remarked, after all, quote, "Without Africa, I could hardly explain me to myself," end quote. There were other problems at home too. Franco enjoyed mass support, but the man wasn't getting any younger. Life under Franco was the very definition of stability, yet life after him was undoubtedly going to be quite the opposite. There was even an Americanized leftist opposition emerging in certain universities, and the Phalange of course staunchly opposed this, as well as the monarchists and all of Catholic society. The Labour minister wrote Franco a 20-page letter by hand in which he worried about the future. Quote, "One refrain is dominating the Spanish landscape. How will things be held together after Franco? And people ask, what will happen when we no longer have Franco? If the monarchy is unpopular and anachronistic to begin with, and without institutional and legal support on its behalf, it will not have adequate defenders. The monarchy would be likely to perish. Now, even the movement is juridicially defenceless. The existing laws are inadequate. For this reason, the defense of the regime must be carried out by the police instead of being done through the law. And instead of tranquility, police action causes alarm. The very facility with which this idea of insecurity has been propagated to the entire nation has convinced Spaniards that the judicial system on which the movement rests has weaknesses that will impede its perpetuation. People don't even debate the conclusion that when it comes time to replace the Caudillo, everything will come to an end. Spaniards are convinced that by that point there will be nothing more to do." End quote. Early 1956 was a busy time for Spain, and there was a tragedy for the royal family too. Juan Carlos had received a pistol as a present at the academy, and when he was back home his father kept it in a locked closet. On the 29th of March, after attending the religious services for Good Friday, he convinced his mother to let him have the gun for some target practice. The boy then placed it in a drawer in his desk. Payne explains the rest of the story. Quote, "While he was trying to concentrate, the mischievous Alfoncito came into the room, simulating a commando attack on his brother, who drove him out, finally locking the door. Undeterred, Alfoncito came back through a different door, adding sound effects. Rat-ta-ta, rat-ta-ta, you're dead, coward." Finally, going along with the game, Juan Carlos looked up, pulled the presumably empty gun from the drawer, and aimed it, clicking the trigger. "The one who is dead is you." But the gun was not empty, and the shot hit the adolescent prince right between the eyes. He fell dead instantly. End quote. The event would plague the royal family, and they would never really get over it, especially so in the case of Donna Maria, the boy's mother, who never really forgave her son. Franco and Donna Carmen were deeply moved, and expressed their deepest condolences to Don Juan and his wife. The following year the Moroccan issue ignited again, as the Moroccan government delivered an ultimatum demanding the Spanish territory of Ifni on the southwest coast. In late November, the Moroccans launched a direct attack on Ifni, in which they tried to take the small Spanish garrison there by surprise. Against all odds, however, the Spaniards held out, and Franco dispatched an armed flotilla with reinforcements. American arms couldn't be used against America's ally Morocco, however, so air attacks were carried out with ancient German planes left over from the Civil War. The French had been wanting to cooperate in their joint aims of maintaining their colonial possessions, and so the two old allies teamed up once more to tackle the Moroccans in both Ifni and the Sahara. By early 1958, all of the Moroccans had been expelled from the region. It was a total military victory. Unfortunately for the Spanish, however, despite winning the war, they had to hand over some territory due to immense American decolonization pressure. It was a farce and infuriated Franco to no end. Spain's neighbour, Portugal, had claimed that its African territories were part of Portugal proper, and therefore couldn't be taken from them by the subversive Americans. Blanco suggested to Franco that he do the same thing, but the Caudillo admitted that the small territory probably couldn't be held in the long run. It was a pointless uphill battle. Ifni itself remained in Spanish hands for another 11 years, until Franco had to hand over the rest of it, again due to American pressure. On this latter occasion, the Moroccans promised the Spanish generous rights for their fishing fleet in Moroccan waters, only to just unilaterally denounce the agreement 3 years later. Meanwhile, Don Juan still wasn't quite playing ball. Franco said in the same vein, quote, "Don Juan's defect is his weak character, so he is influenced by the latest person to come to peddle him gossip," end quote. It was becoming more and more likely that Don Juan's descendants, not Don Juan himself, would be the ones getting crowned in the future. He continued to act subversively, and made constant attacks on Franco, rather than just playing ball and getting the throne he so desperately wanted. Franco called the clique around Don Juan who fed him all this nonsense his Council of Rabbis. Franco said of the monarchy that year, quote, "If Don Juan is willing to change his position by agreeing that the cause of the monarchy is what serves the nation, and that there is no greater obligation than the supreme interest of the fatherland, on behalf of which we must all give up our own desires, I would be willing to consider that, but only on the unequivocal basis of his full support of, and identification with, the regime, without any reservation," end quote. Don Juan, however, was never able to control himself and just act normally. He never identified with the regime, and true to Franco's word, he was never crowned. On the 1st of April 1959, Franco inaugurated the magnificent Valley of the Fallen for the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Civil War's end. 1 billion pesetas had been shelled out on its construction, and ended up being 262 metres long and 41 metres high, with an absolutely massive cross on the hill behind it, visible for many kilometres at 150 metres high. An Augustinian monastery was set up behind the basilica, and the monuments were absolutely covered in religious imagery. It was a true reflection of the cause that Spaniards had fought for in the Civil War. The purpose of this monument was to commemorate those on both sides who had died during the Civil War, and the remains of thousands who had been killed were interred there. Only Catholic Republicans were allowed to be buried, but it's unclear how Franco went about doing the background checks for this. The day before the great inauguration, Phalangists brought the remains of Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera to be buried in front of the high altar in the new basilica. Franco, too, would be buried here when he died. Critics a generation later would complain bitterly about the monument and claim it was built by slave labour. However, such claims are simply untrue. 2,000 prisoners convicted by military courts helped in the construction, and they were given a modest wage as well as benefits for their families. Most importantly of all, they were given a steep reduction in their sentences, so the construction of the monument was seen as a kind of penance for their sins. For every day worked, the prisoners would receive from 2 to 6 days off their sentences, and every single prisoner who worked on the monument was a volunteer, and many of them returned to continue working on the project after they had served their terms. During the 20 years of construction, 14 people did die in unfortunate accidents. However, the majority of these were regular salaried labourers, and indeed, most of the work was carried out not by prisoners, but by normal labourers. 1959 ended with a major public event. On the 21st of December, none other than President Eisenhower came to town, despite much opposition in the American Congress, and from the British government. Franco greeted Ike at the airfield, and they rode into Madrid together in an open car, greeted by more than 1 million Spaniards who lined the streets for the occasion. The president's interpreter wrote, quote, "The crowds in Madrid were very large, and their welcome extraordinarily enthusiastic. I rode in the car with the president and Franco, and I can only report that there were a lot of 'Viva Franco' shouts. The visible popularity of the man, regarded by many as a hated dictator, was not reflected in the press accounts of the visit. Eisenhower, however, was much impressed by this, and the way Franco moved through large crowds," end quote. Eisenhower would remark to the Caudillo that this was the warmest greeting he had ever received anywhere in the world. Franco modestly replied that it reflected an enthusiastic referendum on the nation's foreign policy. The two spoke about Morocco, Western security, Soviet policy, military aid, and the development of the Spanish economy. Franco said to Eisenhower of the latter, quote, "It would not be many years before Spain became a prosperous country," end quote. The conversation got a little more heated when Eisenhower, like all Americans who ever visited, brought up the topic of the limited freedom of Spanish Protestants. Franco angrily replied that not even 1 out of 1,000 Spaniards were Protestant, and that it was a local matter that would be resolved. The foreign minister had to smooth things over, and 3 months later, he would tell the Americans that the problem was being resolved, which wasn't exactly true. Overall, though, the meeting went incredibly well and was a huge propaganda victory for the Franco regime. Franco accompanied Eisenhower on a helicopter for the first time back to the airbase, and the two parted amicably, where a photograph was taken of their very cordial embrace. Few would know it at the time, but the 1950s was the last decade of truly traditional culture and society in Spain. The movement was always going to be somewhat watered down as the hyper-materialistic USA now dominated Europe and imposed its worldview, but it arrived much faster than expected in Spain, and indeed proved irresistible worldwide, as religion and culture were crushed under Uncle Sam's boot. Franco's gigantic religious revival began to slowly wind down throughout the 60s, and decade after decade, society became more and more modernist and decadent. In Spain, the government had been slowly liberalising economically and had become more and more integrated into the international network, and in 1958, Spain joined the International Monetary Fund. The 50s had shown steady growth despite state control, restrictions, inflation, and little overseas investment. By the late 50s, however, Spain ran into trouble, and indeed almost went bankrupt. The finance minister insisted that the only way forward was to massively liberalise by removing restrictions and regulations, devaluing the peseta by 50% of its true market rate, and encouraging massive foreign investment. Franco resisted as much as he could, but he had no choice but to allow a degree of reform. Franco rejected the economic aspects of liberalism as much as the cultural aspects. He said at the time, quote, "The interest of the nation, the common good, and the will of the Spanish people urgently require a transformation of the capitalist system, an acceleration of economic growth, a more just distribution of wealth, social justice, transformation and modernization of credit, and the modernization of many means of production. When the state nationalizes certain industries and services, this is labelled socialism, even though that is accepted in many self-styled liberal states who adopt it from socialism as licit and desirable," end quote. Carrero Blanco went further and suggested that Franco just needed to tighten up his old policy. Franco was stuck between a rock and a hard place, however. Payne explains, quote, "He had always believed that greater economic liberalism would bring in its wake greater political and cultural liberalism, and that a major opening to international trade and investment would open the door to subversive influence from abroad. On the other hand, to reject the plan would probably also mean having to carry out another change of government, the third in 3 years," end quote. After being bombarded with data from his finance minister, however, Franco felt he had no choice, and he bit the bullet. He was proved completely correct with the foreign subversion of Spanish culture, yet within a year, Spain began to experience unbelievable economic growth. Throughout the 1960s, Spain registered the highest rate of sustained growth in Europe, and it was deemed the Spanish miracle. As for Franco's inevitable succession crisis, he met Don Juan for what turned out to be the last time in March 1960. The meeting was extremely cordial, and Don Juan left in a state of euphoria, as Franco had said he wouldn't look outside the royal family for his successor. Don Juan assumed this would be himself, although Franco still wasn't sure about him, as he hadn't dedicated himself to the regime, and was still being dragged to and fro by his advisors. The following year was the last in which Franco would publicly attack Europeanism, as he called it. Soon enough though, Franco saw the writing on the wall here too, like he had with his earlier reforms. The common market was growing and gaining more members. That year, he finally submitted his application to join, although this would be dragged out endlessly by other nations for political reasons, and it wouldn't be until 1967 that the common market leadership began negotiations, and then only slowly. Also in 1961, Secretary of State Dean Rusk came to visit Franco on behalf of the Kennedy administration, which was far more hostile to Franco than Eisenhower had been. By the end of it, Franco was privately describing the Americans as infantile, and he said that he would prefer it if the British led the Western Alliance instead. He also spoke of the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and said that it should have been possible to, quote, "have Fidel Castro with all 4 feet in the air within 24 hours, end quote. He also said that the Americans were ridiculous for not unleashing Chiang Kai-shek in a guerrilla war against the communists in China. Lastly, he said that the only benefit the American military had done was to remove all the B-girls from cabarets and bars in Madrid, as they had all married American soldiers. On July the 18th, 1961, there was a gigantic rally in Burgos before Franco for the 25th anniversary of the nationalist rising. Franco seemed more in control than ever, despite his age. Another ceremony was held, also in Burgos, for the 25th anniversary of Franco's ascension to power on the 1st of October. Here he spoke on the state, quote, "The great weaknesses of modern states lies in their lack of doctrinal content, in having renounced a firm concept of man, life, and history. The major error of liberalism is its negation of any permanent category of truth, its absolute and radical relativism, an error that, in a different form, was apparent in those other European currents that made action their only demand, and the supreme norm of their conduct. When the juridical order does not proceed from a system of principles, ideas, and values recognized as superior and prior to the state, it ends in an omnipotent juridical voluntarism, whether its primary organ be the so-called majority, purely numerical and inorganically expressed, or the supreme organs of power," end quote. Around this same time, Don Juan bent the knee too, or at least it seemed so. He sent a personal congratulations to Franco for the 25th anniversary of the Rising. Quote, "I must proclaim the union of the monarchy with the Rising of the 18th of July, 1936. The political system of an open constitution that currently rules, and that will be inherited by a future regime, enables me to affirm, without doing violence to my own thought, my adherence to the principles and fundamental laws of the movement, which, in addition to being implicit in Spanish traditional doctrine, also contain in advance the necessary flexibility to face all the needs of evolution and of life." End quote. Franco was overjoyed and quickly sent an appreciative response, whereas usually he would wait weeks to reply. On Christmas Eve, the reality that Franco was indeed mortal like everybody else hit him when his shotgun blew up in his hand on a hunting trip. His aide had accidentally double-loaded it, and it had backfired. Despite Franco telling Munoz Grandes, head of the Supreme General Staff, that he should be prepared for the worst possible outcome, it didn't end up coming to that, although he did require serious surgery. Recuperation was slow, and it would take months for Franco's hand to work properly again. On the 30th, whilst Franco was still recovering, the Greek monarchy announced the engagement of the Greek Princess Sofia to Juan Carlos. Later that year, Franco invited the boy to a meeting at El Pardo, and here, Franco openly told him that he had much more possibility of eventually becoming king than his father, to which the boy mildly protested. Franco then gave his blessing for the wedding, but no one in the family attended. Franco sent an admiral to attend in his stead. Later that year, after the wedding, the royal couple came to Madrid, where the Caudillo wanted them to live, and Franco was deeply impressed with Princess Sofia, especially with how quick she was learning Spanish. She could quickly tell how much Franco liked both her and her husband, too. Quote, "He was a Franco quite different from the idea that I had gotten from the press and the opinions I heard. A Caudillo, a proud generalissimo, an imposing dictator. I had imagined him to be harsh and unpleasant, but I found a simple man, wishing to please and very timid." End quote. After she became better acquainted with him, she said to her husband, quote, "Franco's eyes light up when he sees you. He likes to have you near, to explain things to you, to feel that he is your Pygmalion." She was quite right. Franco had no son of his own, and he was deeply disappointed with his own son-in-law. Juan Carlos became like a son to Franco, although later events would clearly show the feeling wasn't mutual. On the 5th of June, 1962, 7 different Spanish political groups met in Munich from both inside and outside Spain, ranging from the left to the centre-right, and they demanded that Franco introduce the return of political parties and democratic elections in Spain. The response from the Spanish people was near unanimous in condemnation, and those who had signed the document were offered voluntary exile or imprisonment upon their return. Almost all of them went into exile. Franco handled the foreign blowback well. However, the biggest loser of the entire situation was Don Juan. 2 leading monarchists had signed the document, and this convinced Franco of Don Juan's eternal double game he had always been playing. Don Juan protested that he had nothing to do with it, and he dropped Gil Robles from his personal counsel, who had been one of the signatories, but the damage was already done in Franco's eyes. His trust was thin as it was. Later, as it turned out, Franco was proved right. The entire thing had been arranged at Juan Carlos's wedding in Athens, and that Don Juan had been told that his advisors would meet with other political figures in Paris. From then on, Franco never seriously considered naming Don Juan as his successor. The only question now was if and when he would recognize Juan Carlos, whom Franco had no problem with except for his father's influence. Almost immediately, this influence made itself felt, as Don Juan refused to let his son live in Madrid. Matters almost immediately became so bad that Juan Carlos's main promoter in the government had to send an emissary to inform him that if he didn't take residence in Spain immediately, then his cause would be lost. Princess Sofia's mother had to personally call up Don Juan's mother to fix the situation, and Don Juan effectively had to do as his mother said. In February 1963, the future royal couple took up residence in Spain. Franco was deeply grateful to Don Juan's mother, the British Princess Victoria Eugenia, and indeed his former queen of 3 decades. He knew that she was a level-headed woman, and he sounded her out on the option of her son renouncing his rights to the throne in favour of her grandson. She replied that she would regret it if Don Juan could not rule, but said that the most important thing was restoring the throne. There was more trouble abroad after the Munich Proclamation too. In April 1963, a military tribunal passed a death sentence on the top communist underground leader, Julian Gramau. He had been sent back to Spain after nearly 2 decades abroad, and during the Civil War he had been in charge of a notorious Checa torture prison in Barcelona, which made him responsible for some of the most unspeakable horrors of the Civil War. There could not have been a more guilty man, even in fiction, yet still the Western powers whipped up a storm of protest, and the communist leader and mass murderer was painted as an innocent oppositionist and peaceful organizer who was going to be executed simply for being a peaceful political opponent. The clemency campaign was led by the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and the mayor of West Berlin. Khrushchev even sent a personal letter to Franco, the first from a Soviet leader, and the Spanish embassy in Paris was firebombed. This situation would give the regime a foreign policy black eye for a while to come, and this was exactly at the time when Franco was wanting to negotiate access to the foreign market. Franco, however, blew off all this ridiculous foreign pressure, and it only made him more obdurate. Gramau was duly put down. Franco's daughter wrote of the whole ordeal, quote, "The truth is that concerning blood crimes my father was almost an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Not quite, but almost. It was very hard for him to pardon someone who had done what Gramau did. And aside from that, he said there was no reason for him to have come back. If he remained abroad, he would have never been prosecuted. But returning to Spain, my father came to believe that Gramau had relied on people who told him, Franco is now a feeble little old man, and he won't do something that would have such a negative effect on foreign opinion, who didn't care about Gramau, but relied on foreign opinion," end quote. At the end of the year, Franco bumped into Don Juan in Madrid at the christening of Juan Carlos and Sofia's first child. Here, the two exchanged polite greetings, but that was all. Afterwards, Don Juan sent Franco a memorandum, urging Franco to recognize him as his successor. Franco categorically refused, and relations from then on were increasingly more hostile. Franco said of the man at that time, quote, "The worst thing that could happen would be for the nation to fall into the hands of a liberal prince, the gateway to communism," end quote. The 1960s continued to be a time of calm, peace, and stability for Franco. In 1965, the Americans reached out asking for support in their Vietnamese adventure in the form of medical and sanitary assistance, yet Franco did not bite. Franco said that the entire operation was a gigantic mistake, as Ho Chi Minh, no matter how Stalinist, was bound to be viewed by many as more of a patriotic independence leader. Franco once again saw foreign policy far more clearly than any of the larger powers, much as he had done all his career. Relations were strained even more the following year with the Americans, when two planes collided off the south coast. One of the planes had been carrying 4 unactivated atomic bombs, and it took 2.5 months to find them all. To eventually assure Spaniards and tourists that the water was safe, the American ambassador and the Spanish Minister of Information had photographs of them in the water in their swimming trunks widely publicized. The Americans promised never to carry atomic weapons over Spain again. In 1968, Ifni, as noted earlier, was finally handed over to Morocco, and that same year, Franco had suddenly granted independence to Equatorial Guinea, and almost completely wiped his hands of the colonial problem. Guinea, like every other African nation who now ruled themselves, fell into chaos. A genocidal dictator took over, killed tens of thousands of civilians, and enslaved many, many more. It was a rough time to be a Guinean. All that remained in Africa for Spain now, except their almost entirely Spanish North African ports, was the Spanish Sahara, and Franco recognized the uselessness of this territory and granted the locals a degree of representation and recognized their right to self-determination. Franco summed up the Sahara, quote, "Seen in isolation, and considering the economic, political and cultural aspects, it has scant value. It has no ports, and the potential for mining is problematic. But strategically, it has enormous importance. It is the counterpart to the security of the Canaries. When we retire from the Sahara, we will begin to compromise the Canaries. When we let go of the Sahara, they will talk about Melilla and Quetta, and next the Canaries. Our strategy requires us to remain in the Sahara if we do not want to run the risk of having to face serious problems elsewhere, especially in the Canaries, related to the integrity of the lands of Africa. However, if this idea of iron unity does not reflect the spirit of the entire people, but rather the desire of coin, an attractive expression to impress superficially, none of the aforesaid has much value. Applause from the rest of the world would definitely be worth a certain number of square kilometers," end quote. There was also the matter of Gibraltar, which cut at the very heart of every Spaniard. In 1963, the issue was finally presented to the UN, and negotiations began, but in 1967 they were shot down when Britain administered a plebiscite, and the result was nearly unanimous. The inhabitants of Gibraltar, regardless of their ethnic background, preferred to remain a British overseas territory. In 1969, Franco simply closed the border, and it remained that way for the rest of his life. He accepted Spain would probably never get the territory back until after his death. It would only go via British withdrawal, not by any Spanish seizure. Foreign matters were one thing, but the real trouble was at home. Franco was an old man, and there was no clear succession. The government was split into two rough camps. The National Movement, and their allies, led by Munoz Grandes, wanted to develop the regime and remained hostile to a monarchist succession, whereas the technocrats were focused more on the economy and wanted to solve the succession issue via John Carlos, and on the latter issue, they were supported by Carrero Blanco. In 1964, Franco had stated during a 25 years of peace celebration, quote, "We are planning to prepare laws that complete and define the powers of the chief of state and of the chief of government, together with the means of their designation. The monarchist system is where our doctrine is best accommodated and our principles assured," end quote. As for changes to the regime itself at the time, Franco mostly refused to hear it. The Minister of Information said, quote, "Franco continued to receive public enthusiasm and thunderous ovations wherever he went. That was his main argument whenever we spoke to him about changes, and that fervour in the summer of 1964 made him resist accepting certain reforms or enacting political changes," end quote. Franco obviously had to make concessions, however, and one of these was a gigantic cutback on censorship in the late 60s. Censorship would now be voluntary, but otherwise there were no official guidelines anymore. There were unofficial ones, however, for which you could still get in trouble, but these were pretty much common sense in a dictatorship. Any editor in doubt regarding their material could simply submit to the voluntary censorship checks. By 1970, Spain published 19,717 new book titles, the fifth highest in the world, amounting to 170 million books. The population had rapidly changed since the Civil War, and Spain was, in general, a far more literate society thanks to Franco's social reforms and just general modernization. Newspaper circulation was up from 500,000 copies in 1945 to 2.5 million in 1967, and there was 915 publishing firms in 1971, compared to 420 in 1940. Almost immediately, Franco felt he had been duped. 6 months later, he was complaining to Fraga that his ministry wasn't presenting the regime's message well enough. The cutback of censorship had indeed been the opening of Pandora's box, yet it was too late to go back now. Subversion had essentially been invited into the system. Franco especially detested the critical remarks regarding the Civil War that were now legal. Quote, "Since they are now publishing adverse commentary about our civil war, but making it seem convincing, we must abandon our policy of silence and support work that deserves it and can receive documentation from us," end quote. In the political arena, the disaffected enemies of yesteryear, or rebellious university students, began to have a field day. Payne writes, quote, "During the mid-1960s, political protest on the part of dissident workers, university students, and also dissident priests slowly but steadily increased, though in November 1965, the new Justice Minister, Antonio Maria Oriol, had been able to declare on television that Spain had the second lowest prison population in the world, proportionate to population. This was technically correct because of the remarkably low rate of common crime, well below that of most democracies or of communist regimes, but as political penalties were lessened, dissidents grew. An effort was made to counter unrest by organising a major visit of Franco to Catalonia in June 1966. This was one of his last grand triumphal tours, for his energy had now markedly declined as he neared 65, but the customary crowds were turned out, and by official standards, the visit came off well, end quote. Payne also writes of the Spanish system in general at that time, quote, "Franco presided over a system in the late 1960s that was beyond all doubt more open, moderate, and responsive than that of 20 or even 10 years earlier. Though the Cortes never became a genuine parliament and never gained the right to initiate legislation, its members became slightly less timid and occasionally criticised aspects of legislation proposed by the government and even enacted a few minor changes. Membership remained oligarchic in the extreme, about half the deputies always being state functionaries who held other positions as well," end quote. In 1967, Franco's ever-loyal and ever-reliable advisor Carrero Blanco was made vice president. There was even a suggestion that Franco was ready to hand over the acting presidency to the highly capable Blanco, but the man himself said it was better to move one step at a time. Franco had now effectively appointed his successor, not in the sense of head of state, as that would of course be the monarch, but in the sense of head of government, like a chancellor in Germany, rather than the president. This was announced on the 21st of September, and from then on until Carrero's departure from this world, the elderly Franco leaned more and more on him. As the late 60s dragged on, many phalangists grew deeply disaffected and felt the movement had been completely and utterly diluted by now. In November 1969, a middle-aged old shirt, as they were known, shot himself in front of a large church in Madrid in protest of the marginalisation of the party. This came to nothing. The following year, the name Phalange was replaced in favour of just National Movement. The name Phalange would now only be used in tiny dissident neo-fascist groups in opposition to the regime. By the end of the decade, the opposition, although from the opposite end of the political spectrum, were getting bolder and bolder. Communist propaganda flooded in from France and Italy, and the youth, now more connected to the world than ever, became increasingly Americanized, secularized, and materialistic. The universities of Barcelona and Madrid were in an endless state of uproar, and the shadow trade unions and worker commissions in the north didn't even bother to conceal themselves anymore. The repression was extremely restrained. In fact, Franco specifically asked the police to go easy on the left-wing dissidents, and they took this as a sign of weakness. To them, the regime was senile and on its last legs. Franco would remark, quote, "Many leftists say that we are now entering the same phase as in the fall of Primo de Rivera or of Berenguer, but they are completely wrong, confusing serenity with weakness," end quote. The most violent of this new era of dissidents was by far the Basque nationalists. The revolutionary organisation, Basque Land and Liberty, better known as the ETA, turned to violence in 1968 and assassinated the head of the political police. This was met with a strong crackdown, but regardless, they weren't done yet. Despite this resistance, the majority of the population was staunchly Francoist. The succession, however, was always a worry at the back of everyone's minds. Blanco considered it high time to officially recognise Juan Carlos as the legitimate successor. Juan Carlos on the surface was playing along with Franco's request of keeping himself out of trouble, but as he would later say privately, he spent, quote, years playing the fool in this country, end quote. Juan Carlos, unlike his father, was able to keep his nose clean and butter up Franco whilst keeping his true feelings a secret. Regardless, Franco knew and accepted that Juan Carlos would perhaps make some limited changes after his own death. Franco was so lenient with the prince, in fact, that he showed little alarm when he received a deeply troubling intelligence report in 1966. Juan Carlos had been to a special dinner meeting with 12 carefully selected moderate liberals and expressed preference for a two-party electoral system under a restored monarchy. A few months later, Franco said, quote, I am certain that little by little the entire country will develop affection for the princes Don Juan Carlos and Donna Sofia, whose conduct is irreproachable, a model in everything, as they lead a life of absolute simplicity and austerity, always trying to be in touch with the needs of the Spanish people. The princes do this absolutely on their own initiative, without my having to be involved, for I think they ought to have freedom of action, end quote. In January 1968, the future royal couple had their first son, and the boy's baptism became a great occasion to bring the entire royal family together. Franco refused to speak with Don Juan, but he did wish to meet with his former queen, Victoria. When they met, for which Franco knew would likely be the last time, he had visible tears in his eyes. She told him that he needed to directly choose a successor from the dynasty before he died, and supposedly, he promised her to do just this. Next door, in Portugal, Salazar was undergoing a rapid and total physical collapse, and this further reminded everyone of Franco's mortality. His advisors, Blanco especially, pressed the Caudillo strongly to appoint a successor before he was infirm. On the 21st of October, 1968, Blanco read out a 15-page document, summarising all the arguments in favour of naming Juan Carlos as heir and doing it rapidly. Franco stared intently at Blanco after the presentation for a while, before bluntly declaring, quote, in agreement with everything, end quote. On the 15th of January 1969, Franco met with Juan Carlos and led him to believe that he would be named as his successor before the end of the year. The now rapidly aging Franco said to the young man, quote, stay perfectly calm, Highness. Do not allow yourself to be swayed by anything. Everything is taken care of, end quote. To which Juan Carlos replied, quote, don't worry, my general. I've already learned a great deal of your Galicianism, end quote. Both of them laughed, and Franco added, quote, your Highness does it well, end quote. The months ticked by, however, and nothing happened. On the 29th of May, General Vega, now 80 years old, came to visit his friend Franco to request his retirement as Minister of the Interior. He found Franco, quote, by that point in a somewhat advanced state of Parkinson's, pale, shrunken, with trembling hands, and Alonso Vega urged him to name his successor very soon, end quote. On the 26th of June, it was Blanco's turn to persuade the Caudillo to hurry, and this time Franco informed him that his decision was made and would be announced within the month. On the 12th of July, Franco duly gave Juan Carlos the news. He would be heir. 4 days later, Don Juan was informed at his residence in Portugal, and he was absolutely devastated. He had been living in denial for years, and now the truth came through like a bulldozer, shattering his world around him. His wife had seen the writing on the wall, and tried to work towards preventing an open breach between father and son, yet this proved impossible for many years. Don Juan refused to renounce his rights to the throne, and reverted to his extreme anti-Franco position that he had held in the mid-40s. He then began an endless series of futile schemes, all the way up until Franco's death. Amazingly, by the time the old Caudillo finally passed away, Don Juan was allied with none other than the communists. On the 23rd of July, there was a ceremony at Juan Carlos's residence, and the future king signed the official document of acceptance before he and Franco rode in a car together for the swearing-in at the Cortes. Juan Carlos was so nervous on the way that he asked Franco, who never allowed smoking in his presence, if he could smoke. Franco, for once in his life, assented. All went as normal, and the future king swore, quote, loyalty to His Excellency the Chief of State, and fidelity to the principles of the movement, and the other fundamental laws of the realm, end quote. At the reception afterwards, Franco cried tears of emotion. The Caudillo finally had a successor in the form of both Juan Carlos and Carrero Blanco. By the end of the decade, Francisco Franco was an elderly man, and clearly on his way out. His previous boundless energy was almost completely gone, and he was a shadow of his former self. Carrero Blanco was the one who essentially ran Spain on Franco's behalf at this point. Payne writes of his importance, quote, "At this point, it was Carrero Blanco, not Juan Carlos, who had come to represent the continuation of the regime. Franco saw him as his natural successor as president of government, the surviving prime minister who would guarantee the transition to Juan Carlos would take place under the laws and institutions of the regime. Carrero Blanco's influence was due not merely to loyalty, but also to his lack of personal ambition. He was an introverted and retiring man of fixed ideas, convinced that the world was dominated by the free internationals, as he terms them, of communism, socialism, and masonry. Father of 5 children and grandfather of 15, he spent a large part of his time reading and writing, had published several books and many short pieces, and continued to prepare lengthy memos for the Caudillo. He was largely immobilist with regard to domestic institutions and viewed foreign affairs in similarly intransient terms, holding that it would be better for all his descendants to die in an atomic war than to survive as slaves of the Soviet Union." End quote. Opposition to the regime had increased as the Caudillo grew more senile and took a less firm line against dissent. The most prolific were still the Basque nationalists and their ETA group. They sought independence for the Basque country, as well as a Marxist-Leninist social revolution, and had for some time now continued to murder police and military officers. Terrorism was also a great love of theirs. One of the most spectacular acts of Basque defiance was in 1970 at a sports game with the Caudillo present. An old veteran of the Basque army in the Civil War simply set himself on fire and leapt off the upper floor of the building, directly in front of Franco. Also in 1970, 6 ETA prisoners have been condemned to death after having been found guilty of killing security officers, amongst other heinous crimes. This caused another international media storm, as they were once again portrayed as freedom fighters. Comparisons to the Inquisition were made, and even the Pope messaged Franco urging clemency. Franco, despite being a devout Catholic to the core, was feeling very lost with the current church leadership, especially after Vatican II. Pressure continued to mount despite the Spanish people obviously favouring these men being put to death. Franco, giving clear signs that he was no longer himself anymore, gave in. The murderers were sentenced to 30 years imprisonment instead, and the military were absolutely disgusted. There were other signs of Franco's terminal decline. On the 2nd of October 1970, Richard Nixon came to visit Madrid, and during a conversation between Nixon and Franco's foreign minister, the Caudillo actually fell asleep. The crowd was only 1/3 the size of the one that came out for Eisenhower, although 300,000 people were still an awful lot of people. In February, the deputy chief of the CIA came to talk to Franco, and when he tried to give the Caudillo a letter from Nixon, quote, "his hand trembled violently, and he motioned for the foreign minister to take it," end quote. He also spoke more generally, quote, "his left hand trembled so violently on occasion that in an effort to conceal it, he would cover it with his other hand. At times he appeared far away, and at others he came right to the point," end quote. The two leaders spoke very openly about the seemingly imminent transition to a new leader. As for this new leader though, Franco made no attempts to impose himself upon him. One of Juan Carlos's household attendants recalled, quote, "In fact, the prince, analysing his conversation with Franco on political themes, reached the conclusion that he had left him complete liberty, not wanting to mortgage his future, and that it was very possible that Franco honestly did not seek to condition the man who would have to face a future that Franco could not determine. Or perhaps he thought that the prince, in his silence, in his observer's stance, was thoroughly imbued with Francoist spirit, and that this would lead him to manoeuvre efficiently without ever moving his feet from the regime of the 18th of July. It is very hard, not to say impossible, to know exactly what Franco thought. It is nonetheless easy to learn how he acted. And with Juan Carlos, he acted without imposition, almost without pressure, but with vague indications and paternal counsel that were merely general orientations concerning given themes, but he never indoctrinated him explicitly. He never told him what he must do," end quote. In 1973, Franco accepted that he could no longer run the government himself, as things were clearly out of control. Everything came to a head on May Day, when a policeman was trapped in an alley by communist militants known as FRAP, and then literally hacked to death. The regime was visibly weak, and support was falling off a cliff. The Interior Minister handed in his resignation, stating that the movement no longer had a following. Shortly afterwards, Franco set in motion the mechanism by which a new president would be appointed, and on the 8th of June, Carrero Blanco was officially made president of government. The new cabinet was essentially all elected by Blanco. The new president set about reinvigorating the regime, and about saving Spain from the terrorist menace that was sweeping the nation, although he was far from ruthless. Blanco was the only man in Spain who could possibly salvage the movement from its current precarious situation, in which it looked essentially doomed as soon as Franco died. The entire nation, the entire movement, and the united Catholic Spain which Franco had maintained was on Blanco's shoulders alone. All these hopes were soon dashed, and Franco's Spain essentially died on the 20th of December, 1973. Carrero Blanco attended Mass every single morning at the same church using the same route. He never had much security, as until recently, as noted, Spain was one of the safest nations on planet Earth. This was taken advantage of, and the ETA blew his car sky high, and it landed on the 4th floor landing of the church across the street. The main Spanish Communist Party was directly involved too. Revenge wouldn't be taken until 1978, when ironically, one of the assassins was blown up by a car bomb planted by Basque fascists. The murder of this much-loved father and grandfather broke Franco's heart. Quote, Franco at first accepted the news with his customary stoicism, but soon gave way to emotional despair. Though the two had never been genuinely intimate, Franco had relied on Carrero enormously. Privately, he expressed complete dismay, saying that his last link with public life was broken. He retired for the remainder of the day and refused to eat. Though feverish and ill with the flu, the next morning he insisted on presiding at the usual weekly meeting of the Council of Ministers. At the beginning, he broke into tears, the first time that his ministers had ever seen him cry, end quote. At the memorial service, the Caudillo acted much the same. At its conclusion, the Cardinal Archbishop moved to embrace Franco. The aged and emotionally exhausted Caudillo broke down completely, sobbing inconsolably over the loss of his closest and most trusted collaborator. The same emotion was expressed a few moments later, as Franco sought to comfort the widow. Captured on national television, this was the first time the Spanish public had ever seen the Generalissimo cry, end quote. Another reminder that the end was nigh took place in April 1974, when the Estado Novo, the longest-lived authoritarian state in Western Europe, was overthrown in neighbouring Portugal. With the massive concessions granted over the previous decade, the left-wing Spanish press felt confident enough to comment favourably on the socialist revolution taking place next door. In July, Franco's health completely collapsed after a thrombophlebitis attack. The 81-year-old Franco was walked into the Ciudad Sanitaria Provincial. He refused a wheelchair but muttered, "This is the beginning of the end." Before he had even left El Pardo, he had ordered his ministers to prepare the document for the transfer of powers. Franco's daughter, Carmen, wrote of this trying time for the Franco family. Quote, "We lived through it all with him there in the hospital, which now is called Gregorio Maranon, but then was called Francisco Franco. How long were we there? An entire week? And increasingly worried because that was when he began to bleed from the intestines. There were complications, and we could already see, though he lasted an entire year more. His spirit was serene. I think that he understood that he was entering the final phase, and he accepted that," end quote. On the 18th of July, Franco was unable to attend the anniversary celebrations, but the festivities still made his health worse. He watched the patriotic film, Letters to a Child, and it took such an emotional toll on Franco that he broke down into tears and suffered a hemorrhage. On the 19th, Franco signed the document for the transfer of powers, and Juan Carlos assumed the duties of Chief of State the following day. Against all odds, however, Franco began to recover rapidly, and on the 30th he left the hospital for his summer residence. This recovery continued into August, and Franco was left with the decision of whether to resume his powers or proceed to the coronation of Juan Carlos. It didn't take him long to make up his mind. Payne writes, quote, "By the close of the month, however, he had firmly decided to return, apparently above all thanks to a report he received from his most loyal minister, Utrera Molina. Utrera paid Franco a special visit on the 28th to tell him that plans were underway to dissolve the movement, to reinstate political parties, including the Communist Party, and even to have Franco himself declared physically and mentally incompetent." This exaggerated account, together with other things he had heard concerning telephone conversations between Juan Carlos and his father, as well as the prince's indirect contacts with the political opposition, dispelled any remaining doubts in Franco's mind about the need to resume power, end quote. On the 1st of September, Franco's physicians declared that his health had returned to normal. In his final year, the Caudillo's best features began to shine through, and he displayed patience, discipline, and good humour throughout the entire traumatic ordeal. Despite this, he had suffered periods of depression during his illness, and one of his ministers even showed him old army marches to raise his spirits and get him exercising. Regardless, he was still mostly at peace with his own mortality. Quote, "What I do has no merit whatsoever, because I simply fulfill a providential mission with the help of God. I meditate before him, and generally find my problems resolved. When he considers my task is completed, he will call me away, and I have often asked him that, if possible, this be done with a certain rapidity," end quote. By November, the Caudillo was hunting again, although a January expedition in near-freezing temperatures proved too much, and he had to spend the next morning in bed and cancelled the rest of the hunt. As for Spain at large, things were bleak. In September, a coffee shop across the street from the National Police headquarters was bombed by the ETA, and 12 people died whilst 80 were injured. None of the dead were police officers. In the Basque Country especially, the resistance continued to grow and grow. From 73 to 75, almost 7,000 locals were arrested. Franco deemed this increasing chaos to be the fault of the liberalised legal system. Quote, "We have a serious problem with the judges and lawyers because they consider such savage acts to be political, when in fact they are only criminal murders. They talk and talk of human rights, but ignore the human rights of innocent victims who are treacherously murdered. Why should they respect the rights of these killers, cruel assassins who have violated those of their victims? These people who try to disintegrate society should be treated with the maximum energy. Either we finish them off or they finish us off." End quote. As 1975 drifted along, the signs mounted that Juan Carlos was going to completely overhaul Spain into something completely foreign, and his contacts with the opposition were extensive. Franco became more and more emotional as the end approached. On one occasion that summer, months before the end, some veterans from the Civil War came to visit him, and they affirmed their absolute loyalty to the Caudillo. Franco immediately broke down into tears again. His military aide described the scene, quote, "It was hot and Franco collapsed, beginning to sob like a child. I handed him dark glasses and ordered the lieutenants to withdraw. Franco continued to weep on my shoulder, while exclaiming, 'They want to destroy Spain.' It was a terrible scene." End quote. Franco was not quite done yet, however. On the 22nd, the government approved a new anti-terrorism measure, which would dish out the death penalty for anyone who killed a policeman or other state employee. A wave of arrests then took place which shut down the FRAP terrorist network. The law was applied retroactively to 11 revolutionaries from ETA and FRAP. In this instance, Franco still wasn't as strong as he used to be, but regardless, he held somewhat firm. Quote, "These sentences occasioned the biggest international campaign against the regime ever waged by the European left, some of whom exhibited greater indignation over the punishment of these killers than they had, for example, over the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, or would, subsequently, over the communist genocide in Cambodia. Pope Paul VI twice urged commutation, though Franco apparently would not receive his calls." End quote. In the end, Franco did commute 6 of the sentences, but 5 of the others were put down on the 27th of September. Spanish tourist offices, banks and consulates all over Europe were attacked, and the embassy in Lisbon was completely burnt down. 15 nations withdrew their ambassadors from Spain, all over 5 terrorists who had killed innocent people. On the 1st of October 1975, as usual, a huge crowd developed outside the royal palace to greet Franco on the 39th anniversary of his elevation to power. The old man could now barely be heard as he was so feeble, yet regardless he gave an anti-communist speech to his people, and spoke of the degeneration of Western society. He finished with, quote, "Evidently, to be Spanish is once again something serious in the world. Arriba España." End quote. He then turned to Juan Carlos and fell sobbing into his arms, once again, as usual in these years, overcome with emotion. On that same day, 4 policemen were murdered in Madrid, and several more were killed a few days later. The old Spain Franco knew was gone. Pornography had filtered into the media, foreign ideals had once again crept into Spain, and the religious revival that had been so strong after the Civil War had subsided beneath the Americanization of the West. Crime now filled the streets, a stark contrast to just a decade or so earlier. Franco was truly living in a foreign land. He was the last of a near-extinct breed. His last appearance in public was on the 12th of October at the Institute of Hispanic Culture. Here, on television, he was unable to rise to his feet after 3 attempts. The building hadn't been heated and it was unusually cold for that time of year, too. And by the time Franco got back to El Pardo, he was diagnosed with a cold. On the 15th, he suffered a minor heart attack. His vitals were afterward okay, and he claimed to feel fine, yet an elaborate medical team now surrounded him, as he refused to go to hospital again like last year. At the same time, the Moroccan king, Hassan, ordered a massive march of civilians into the Spanish Sahara, which steadfastly did not want to become part of Morocco. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were to march in with armed military units infiltrated amongst them. They would dare the Spanish authorities to open fire on civilians. The Moroccans had American support as they didn't want the Sahara to fall under the influence of pro-Soviet Algeria. This crisis infuriated Franco to no end, as he felt Hassan until now had been bluffing. The government met on the 17th of October at Franco's residence, and the Caudillo barely made it through and his pulse shot up. Henceforth, he would essentially not direct the government ever again. Franco laid in bed all day, and Juan Carlos came to visit him daily, sometimes for a brief greeting, and sometimes they would sit and chat for a while. In his last words to the prince, he emphasized the unity of Spain. The prince recalls, quote, "More than the words, what surprised me was the strength with which he clasped my hands within his, and the intensity of his look as he told me that the only thing he asked for was that I preserve the unity of Spain. I will never forget that last look." End quote. On the 19th of October, Franco's bedroom was converted into a chapel, and the family chaplain said Mass and administered extreme unction. For the next 2 weeks, Mass was said daily. On the 20th, Franco got out of bed for the last time to receive a visit from the president of the Cortes. The following day, Franco asked Carmen to fetch a short text from his study that was prepared weeks beforehand. It was to be his last message to the Spanish people. They read over the text together, and he asked her to write up a clean copy on a typewriter. Carmen was then to guard it with the strictest secrecy until after his death. On the 23rd, Franco's condition worsened considerably. By the 26th, Madrid newspapers featured the headline, "Franco is dying." Extreme unction was administered once again that day. Carmen then read him a telegram from Pope Paul, praying for divine aid and giving him apostolic blessing. Franco immediately burst into tears. On the 30th, Franco suffered another mild heart attack and was diagnosed with acute peritonitis. When he got the news, he finally accepted the reality of his situation and said that it was time to put the succession law into effect. Upon being assured that Franco's condition was irreversible, the prince accepted the transfer. Franco's dictatorship of 4 decades had officially come to an end. It wasn't an easy death for the Caudillo. He was heard to remark to his family, quote, "How hard this is," or "My God, what a struggle it is to die," and "I didn't realise dying was so hard." On the 3rd of November, Franco suffered a massive, uncontrollable gastric hemorrhage, and his physicians thought they heard a barely conscious Franco say, quote, "Please leave me, it's hard to die," end quote. The family decided he shouldn't be allowed to drown in his own blood, and after several hours of surgery, his life was saved with 7 litres of blood transfused. He was now increasingly sedated. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the Spanish Sahara was abandoned to the Moroccans by Franco's incompetent ministers, and a time of bloody repression, exploitation, and death followed for the local inhabitants of the region. The Spanish government had completely reneged on their promises to the locals, who feared the Moroccans like the plague. A period of slow, painful, and increasingly public death then followed as everyone awaited the latest news every single day of their leader's condition. Eventually, against Franco's earlier wishes, he was transferred to the nearby hospital. He was continuously operated on and essentially artificially kept alive pointlessly, despite having expressly asked to be left to die earlier on several occasions. Juanito, his faithful valet, returned for the final crisis and pointed out to the crowds of people, quote, "They don't realise that he doesn't want anyone to see him like this," end quote. On the 14th of November, Franco suffered another huge hemorrhage and he had a 3rd surgery. From then on, the Caudillo was completely sedated and never regained consciousness. Carmen says of these painful days and the artificial prolongation of her father's life, quote, "Yes, physicians are a little manic about it, but when you have reached the end, there's no point to it. Yes, it was a series of circumstances. It was very hard, because it went on so long, and I feel a bit responsible for having let him be taken to La Paz, where he died. The truth is that no more could be done because when the organs began to fail, it's better not to insist, but the doctors are determined to carry on the struggle to the end. It was more a decision by them than by the family. In the family, we were all wiped out. There was a series of heart specialists because that was the original problem, and then the intestinal surgeons because of the hemorrhages, and these were the ones who decided to go on, and we could not deny them. That goes without saying, above all, when you see a person bleeding like that," end quote. In the evening of the 19th, Carmen Franco kissed her father's forehead for the last time and left the hospital. A little later, the cardiologist told Franco's son-in-law, who was sleeping in the next room, that Franco was being kept alive by manual heart massage. Villaverde stated that they should cease their efforts and then disconnected the life support tubes himself. Carmen recalls, quote, "My husband did it. Cristobal was with all the doctors and knew there was nothing more to do. At that point, I spent more time with my mother, since my father was unconscious. I was worried more about her, since she also had heart trouble, really more concerned about her, because my father was no longer aware of who was with him. That was the end," end quote. At 3:20 a.m, Franco was announced dead, 14 days short of his 83rd birthday. All over Spain, sacred relics were dispatched to join with the petrified hand of Santa Teresa, which Franco had kept always near his bed. And the nation cried out as one at the death of their beloved Caudillo. Meanwhile, in the émigré opposition party headquarters in Paris, the champagne supplies were exhausted several times over as they celebrated their victory. These degenerate scenes were quite the contrast to Franco's last message, in which he asked for the forgiveness of his enemies, as he had long since forgiven them. On the morning of the 20th, it was read on national television, quote, "Spaniards, when the hour comes for me to surrender my life before the Most High and appear before his implacable judgment, I pray that God may receive me graciously into his presence, for I sought always to live and die as a Catholic. In the name of Christ I glory, and my constant will has been to a faithful son of the Church, in whose bosom I am going to die. I ask pardon of all, as with all my heart I forgive those who declare themselves my enemies, though I might not have held them to be such. I desire and believe to have had none other than those who were enemies of Spain, which I love until the final moment, and which I promise to serve until my last breath, which I know to be near," end quote. It continued on to thank all those who had supported him, and urged them to serve Juan Carlos equally as faithfully. It ended, quote, "I should like, in my final moment, to join the names of God and of Spain, and to embrace you all to cry together, for the last time, at the moment of my death, Arriba España, Viva España," end quote. 20 days of official mourning followed the death, and the nation turned up in their hundreds of thousands to view his body as it laid in state in the royal palace on the 21st and 22nd. According to an opinion survey at the time, over 80% of Spaniards regarded Franco's death as a loss to Spain. Europe had lost its most popular leader, and indeed, no nation would be as united behind one man as Spain was behind their caudillo ever again. Franco's funeral took place on the 23rd, and Spain's era of revival, Catholicism, stability, peace, patriotism and traditionalism officially came to an end as the caudillo was lowered into the ground at the Valley of the Fallen. Perhaps with him into the ground went the Spain of Isabella, the Spain of Charles V, and the Spain of his son, Philip II, for almost immediately after Franco was dead and buried, a new, liberal, atheistic and materialistic Spain took root, led forwards by Juan Carlos, who, whether he had a choice or not, handed the nation over to the enemies of Catholic Spain. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you made it this far, then please do leave a like, it helps immensely. Usually, this is the part where I would individually thank my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members for their kind contributions, but since the channel took off recently, the list is sadly too long to read out anymore, without it taking 5 minutes. But regardless, the support is greatly appreciated, and it is purely thanks to this generous support that I am able to do this for a living, and I cannot thank everyone enough.